This is 30 ancient sites that were sealed shut forever the moment someone opened them. Number 1. The tomb of the first Qin emperor. In March of 1974, a group of farmers were digging a well in the dry fields of Shanxi province in China, hoping to reach water in a drought. Their shovels went down through the dirt, and instead of hitting a spring, they hit a head. A clay head, roughly life-sized, staring back up at them from the soil. They kept digging, and more pieces came up. Arms and torsos and legs, all fired clay, all buried in neat rows just under the surface of their field. Those farmers had put their well right on top of the terracotta army. The man they'd disturbed was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China back in 221 BC. He was the guy who linked up the early walls into what became the Great Wall, who standardized the money and the writing, and who then spent an enormous chunk of his reign building himself a place to be buried. And when a Chinese emperor built a tomb, he didn't pack a few pots and call it done. Qin Shi Huang had an entire army made for him out of clay. Thousands of soldiers, each with a slightly different face, plus horses and chariots and archers, all of them lined up in underground pits to guard him after death. Historians estimate the whole necropolis took something like 700,000 workers to build, which is less a construction project and more a small country digging for decades. So the terracotta soldiers get all the attention, and they're worth it. But they were only the guards. They were standing watch outside the actual tomb, which sits under a giant earthen mound about 1.5 miles away, shaped like a low hill covered in trees. And that mound has never been opened, not by the farmers, not by the Chinese government, not by anyone in over 2,000 years. The soldiers have been excavated, cataloged, and put behind glass for tourists. The central burial chamber of the emperor himself is still sealed under the hill, exactly the way it was left when the dirt was piled on top. Part of the reason why comes down to a warning written down a very long time ago. Around 100 years after the emperor died, a historian named Sima Qian wrote an account of the tomb, and he described what was supposedly inside. He wrote about a vast underground palace with a ceiling set with pearls to mimic the stars, and models of the empire's rivers and seas built across the floor. And those rivers, according to Sima Qian, were filled with flowing liquid mercury, kept moving by some mechanism so they'd shimmer like real water. For a long time, people treated that as a nice legend, the sort of thing an old chronicler embroiders to make a dead emperor sound grander. Then modern teams ran soil surveys across the mound, and the readings came back showing mercury levels far above what you'd ever find naturally in that ground, concentrated right over the spot where the chamber is supposed to be, which lines up unnervingly well with a 2,000-year-old book describing rivers of the stuff. So the legend of the Mercury Rivers stopped being just a legend and started being a soil chemistry problem. That mercury is one reason nobody's in a hurry to dig. If the account is right, cracking the chamber open could release a cloud of toxic vapor into the excavation. But it isn't the only reason, and honestly, it isn't even the main one. The main reason is what happened to the soldiers when they first came out of the ground. Those terracotta figures weren't the plain gray you see in photographs today. When they were made, they were painted brightly in reds and greens and purples and blues, with lacquer underneath the color to make it stick. And for 2,000 years, sealed in the dark and the damp, that paint survived. Then the archaeologists opened the pits and let the air in. Within a matter of minutes, as the surface dried out, the lacquer curled away from the clay, and the paint flaked off and fell to the ground. Some estimates put it at a matter of seconds for the color to start lifting once a figure was exposed. Teams watched the paintwork of an emperor's guard vanish faster than they could photograph it. So the lesson the archaeologists took was a quiet, uncomfortable one. Whatever is inside that central tomb has been sitting in a stable, sealed environment since the 3rd century BC. The paint, the organic materials, the textiles, anything delicate down there survives only because the air has never touched it. Open the door with today's technology, and you might be trading a sealed mystery for a room full of ruined, colorless artifacts within the hour. The official Chinese position has been to wait. The government has repeatedly declined to excavate the main mound, saying the preservation technology isn't there yet, that they'd rather leave it intact for a future generation that can open it without destroying it. It's a rare thing, a government sitting on top of one of the greatest archaeological prizes on Earth and choosing deliberately not to look inside. So the well the farmers were digging back in 1974 did eventually reach something, just not water. And the hill a mile away still sits there under its trees, closed, the soil above it still reading high for mercury, the emperor still down in the dark exactly where they left him. Number 2, Tutankhamun's tomb and the sealed chambers. In November of 1922, an English archaeologist named Howard Carter stood in a cramped, dark corridor under the Egyptian desert and struck a chisel against a plastered doorway. He chipped a small hole through the upper left corner. He inserted an iron testing rod, feeling only empty space on the other side. Then he lit a candle, held it to the gap to check for toxic gases, and pressed his eye to the stone. He saw gold, chariots, statues of animals, beds carved like beasts, all of it reflecting the candlelight out of the dark. When his financial backer, Lord Carnarvon, asked if he could see anything, Carter simply said he saw wonderful things. Carter and Carnarvon had spent years digging in the Valley of the Kings. By 1922, the conventional wisdom among archaeologists was that the valley was basically empty. Grave robbers had cracked open the royal tombs centuries ago, stripping the gold and leaving the mummies in pieces. Carnarvon was a wealthy aristocrat paying for the labor, and he was nearly out of patience. He told Carter this was their last season. They found the stone steps hidden under the foundations of ancient workmen's huts. At the bottom of the stairs sat a door. It was covered in plaster, and pressed into that plaster was the official stamp of the royal necropolis, a jackal standing over 9 bound captives. That seal meant everything. It meant the door had been closed by the priests of the boy king Tutankhamun around 1324 BC, and it had stayed closed. No thieves had tunneled through. The tomb survived intact simply because the rubble from a later tomb construction was dumped directly on top of it, burying the entrance under tons of limestone chips. Carter breached the door. The team hauled out thousands of artifacts. They dismantled heavy gilded shrines and opened nested coffins to find the king's solid gold mask. But opening the sealed door also let in the global press. 5 months after Carter looked through that hole, Lord Carnarvon was staying at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo. He accidentally sliced open a mosquito bite on his cheek while shaving. The bite became infected with erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection. Carnarvon developed blood poisoning, then pneumonia, and he died. The newspapers took a shaving accident and turned it into a supernatural hitman. The papers claimed a curse had been unleashed by breaking the seals. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, publicly suggested an evil elemental spirit had murdered the Earl. A journalist claimed the lights in Cairo flickered out the moment Carnarvon stopped breathing. Other people loosely connected to the dig, or just people who happened to own Egyptian artifacts, died of various entirely normal causes over the next decade, and the press added them to the tally. The Curse of the Boy King sold a massive number of newspapers. The curse also had terrible aim. Howard Carter, the man who actually broke the seal and opened the coffins, lived for another 17 years, eventually dying of lymphoma at age 64. The media circus eventually faded. The artifacts went into display cases in Cairo. The empty tomb became a tourist site, fitted with wooden walkways and fluorescent lights. The walls of the burial chamber, covered in bright yellow murals of the king, standing with various gods, were treated as the final boundary of the space. Then, in 2015, an English Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves started looking at high-resolution laser scans of those painted walls. A company called Factum Arte had mapped the surface of the burial chamber to build a replica for tourists. The paint had suffered from decades of visitors exhaling moisture and bringing in dust, so the replica was meant to take the pressure off the original. They captured the exact texture of the plaster down to the millimeter. When Reeves examined the raw surface data without the paint distracting him, he noticed straight vertical and horizontal lines hiding underneath the plaster on the north and west walls. They looked exactly like the outlines of sealed doorways. Reeves published a paper proposing that Tutankhamun's tomb was actually just an antechamber. He suggested the boy king died so unexpectedly at age 19 that he was hastily buried in the outer rooms of a larger tomb, one originally built for someone else. And behind that north wall, Reeves thought, sat the undisturbed mummy of Queen Nefertiti. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities brought in a Japanese radar specialist named Hirokatsu Watanabe. Watanabe ran a ground-penetrating radar machine across the north wall. His results showed empty space behind the stone. He also claimed the radar picked up metallic and organic signatures lying in that void. The ministry announced they were 90% sure there was a hidden chamber. A second radar team, funded by National Geographic, went in a year later to confirm it. They ran their own scans and found completely solid rock. No void, no metal, no hidden queen. So the ministry brought in a third team from Turin University in 2018. They used 3 different types of high-frequency radar, scanning the wall on a tight grid pattern. Their data showed no structural breaks, no empty space, and no doorways. The initial Japanese scans were chalked up to ghost reflections, bouncing off the painted walls of the tiny cramped room. But radar data is just data. The only way to prove what was behind the plaster was to physically drill a hole and insert a fiber optic camera. And a hole requires cutting through a 3,300-year-old mural. You have to destroy part of a priceless artifact to test a theory that 2 out of 3 radar teams said was wrong. The debate dragged on, weighing the potential of a massive discovery against the absolute certainty of damaging the wall. The Egyptian government eventually made a decision. They ruled out any invasive exploration. No drilling, no cutting, no small holes in the corner. The physical integrity of the burial chamber took priority over the radar anomalies. They left the plaster untouched. The north wall still stands, covered in painted figures, and whatever Watanabe's machine bounced off of in 2015 is still sitting in the rock behind it. Number 3. The Sealed Cave of Lascaux. In September of 1940, an 18-year-old mechanic named Marcel Ravidat was walking his dog through the woods in southwestern France. The dog started scratching at a depression under a fallen tree. The dirt gave way, and the dog vanished down a narrow shaft. Marcel climbed down after him, dropping into a pile of loose rock in the pitch black. He came back a few days later with 3 friends, a knife, and a makeshift lamp fueled by grease. They widened the hole, slid 15 feet down the rubble chute, and held up the light. They were standing inside a massive limestone cavern. The walls and the ceiling were entirely covered in animals. There were herds of horses, stags with massive antlers, and black bulls stretching 15 feet across the rock, all painted in thick reds, yellows, and blacks. The boys had found a gallery of prehistoric art created by people living roughly 17,000 years ago. The ancient artists had crushed mineral pigments like ochre and hematite, mixed them with animal fat, and blown the paint onto the rock through hollow bones. One ceiling panel featured 4 massive aurochs, an extinct species of wild cattle, painted over earlier drawings of red bears. Deep in a lower section called the shaft, there was a drawing of a human figure with a bird's head falling backward in front of a disemboweled bison. At some point shortly after the last artist left, a rockfall had sealed the entrance. The cavern spent the next 17 millennia in perfect darkness, maintaining a completely stable internal climate. There was no wind, no sunlight, and no fluctuation in humidity. The paintings survived purely because they were locked in a geologic vault. The teenagers told their school teacher, Leon Laval, who climbed down the hole himself and brought in experts to verify the paint. The site became famous almost overnight. Following the end of the Second World War, the French government decided to capitalize on the discovery. They brought in heavy machinery to widen the entrance. They poured concrete steps, ripped out tons of protective earth to make a flat walkway, installed a heavy metal door, and wired the cavern with electric lights. In 1948, Lascaux officially opened to the public. By 1955, roughly 1,200 tourists were walking down those concrete stairs every single day. A cave is a closed respiratory system. It operates on a fragile atmospheric balance. If you put 1,200 tourists into a sealed limestone box, they exhale gallons of water vapor and carbon dioxide. Their combined body heat raises the ambient temperature of the air. When that heavy, damp carbon dioxide hits the cold limestone walls, it forms a weak carbonic acid. That acid eats into the rock. The environmental balance inside Lascaux completely collapsed within a decade. First came the white sickness. The chemical reaction between the human breath and the rock caused white calcite crystals to grow rapidly across the walls. The crystals began cementing a layer of opaque stone right over the painted bulls. Then the green sickness arrived, a highly aggressive algae fed by the heat of the electric lights, and the endless supply of moisture from the tourists began spreading in dark green patches over the 17,000-year-old horses. The visitors were literally breathing the art to death. In 1963, the French Minister of Cultural Affairs, André Malraux, ordered the cave shut. The government locked the metal doors, barred the public, and sealed Lascaux. To keep the tourism revenue flowing, they quarried out a separate space a few hundred yards down the road and built a concrete bunker. They called it Lascaux II. The government employed teams of artists to meticulously recreate the contours of the cave and repaint the bulls on fake walls, so visitors could look at a pristine copy while the original rested in the dark. Closing the metal door on the real cave did not fix the problem. The ecosystem was already shattered, and the government's attempts to stabilize it caused new outbreaks. In 2000, officials decided to upgrade the cave's air conditioning and climate control system. Construction crews spent months inside the cavern, tearing out old pipes and installing new machinery. They tracked in dirt, altered the airflow, and introduced new spores on their boots and equipment. The following year, a completely new strain of white fungus erupted across the cave floor. It spread like a carpet and began climbing the walls toward the lower paintings. The French Ministry of Culture deployed intervention teams. The workers put on full-body hazmat suits, boots, and respirators to step inside. They sprayed the cavern heavily with fungicides and antibiotics, treating the ancient limestone like an infected wound. The crews used small motorized vacuums and soft brushes to physically lift the dead spores off the rock without scraping away the ancient ochre underneath. They killed the white mold, but the dead fungus left behind dark black stains on the rock, right at the edges of the ancient paint. The site is now managed like an intensive care unit for a dying patient. The climate control system runs constantly, monitored by sensors that track the temperature to fractions of a degree, keeping the air at exactly 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy metal doors stay locked year-round. The only people allowed inside are a small maintenance team and a select group of conservation scientists. When they enter the cavern, they wear sterile suits and limit their visits to a maximum of 20 minutes. They are allowed inside on just a few days out of the entire year, just long enough to check the monitors, photograph the walls, and sweep the rock for new outbreaks of mold. Number 4. The sealed chamber beneath Chichen Itza. Divers descending into the flooded cave systems of the Yucatan Peninsula drop into perfectly clear water. The liquid is filtered through miles of porous rock. Flashlights cut through the dark, illuminating thick limestone stalactites and the pale roots of jungle trees, reaching down through the ceiling to drink. Above them, separated by 100 feet of solid stone, sits El Castillo. The massive stepped pyramid marks the center of the ancient Maya city of Chichen Itza. The entire Yucatan Peninsula is essentially a giant limestone sponge. Surface rivers do not exist here. The freshwater runs entirely underground through a massive network of tunnels and sinkholes called cenotes. The Maya built their cities directly around these sinkholes. They relied on them for drinking water, and they viewed them as physical doorways to the underworld. Dropping into a cave meant entering the territory of the gods. The Maya left offerings in the dark. They brought down ceramic plates, jade jewelry, and heavy clay incense burners to ask for rain during droughts. The deeper and tighter the cave, the closer they were to the gods. Over centuries, the dry passages, branching off the flooded sinkholes under Chichen Itza, filled up with these ritual objects. In 1966, a local farmer named Tomas Perez was walking through the scrubland near the ruins. He found a small opening in the rock. He squeezed through the gap and crawled into a dry section of the cave system. He navigated a tunnel barely big enough for his shoulders and ended up in a series of natural chambers. The floors were covered with ancient pottery. Perez went to the local authorities and told a prominent Mexican archaeologist named Victor Segovia Pinto about the hole. Pinto gathered a small team and climbed down into the earth. They crawled on their stomachs for hours through passages that narrowed to 16 inches high. They reached the main chambers and pointed their flashlights at the floor. The ground was packed with hundreds of untouched artifacts. The most striking pieces were massive ceramic incense burners shaped like the rain god Tlaloc, complete with his signature goggle eyes and fanged teeth. They found jadeite plates and heavy grinding stones. Everything was covered in a thick layer of white calcite, cemented to the cave floor by dripping water over 1,000 years. Segovia Pinto wrote up a brief initial report on the discovery. He noted the incredible volume of the offerings and the pristine condition of the chambers. Then he did something highly unusual for an archaeologist in the 1960s. He refused to excavate. He told the local farmers to gather rocks from the surrounding jungle. He directed them to build a thick stone wall across the main tunnel. They mixed mortar, sealed the stones in place, and closed the cavern off from the surface. Pinto never officially explained why he walled up the site. Researchers who knew him point to a few practical realities. Extracting hundreds of fragile calcite, encrusted ceramics through a 16-inch crawl space is a logistical nightmare. The artifacts would likely break in transit. The local museum had no space to store them, and the regional budget lacked the funds to cover a massive preservation effort. There was also a quieter, more philosophical reason. Pinto respected the context of the offerings. The Maya had placed those incense burners in the underworld deliberately. Pulling them out and putting them on a brightly lit museum shelf stripped them of their meaning. Sealing the cave protected them from looters and kept the site exactly as the ancient priests intended. The cavern sat behind its masonry wall for another 52 years. The locals kept quiet. The broader archaeological community completely forgot the report. Then, in 2018, a team from the Great Maya Aquifer Project began mapping the water systems under Chichen Itza. A National Geographic explorer named Guillermo de Anda was leading a search for a rumored hidden cenote directly beneath the main pyramid. De Anda's team hired a local guide to show them a series of old cave entrances. The guide was a 68-year-old man. It was Tomas Perez, the same farmer who found the hole as a teenager. Perez led them back to the entrance. The team squeezed into the dark and crawled through the mud. They reached the stone wall Segovia Pinto had built. The mortar was crumbling. They carefully dismantled the rocks and slid their headlamps into the void. They rediscovered the cavern. They named it Balamku, the cave of the jaguar god. The scale of the site was staggering. The team documented 7 separate ritual chambers, branching off the main tunnel. They counted over 150 intact artifacts. The incense burners still held the charred remains of copal resin, seeds, and small animal bones burnt as offerings around 1000 AD. The calcified drips from the ceiling locked the ceramics in place, like natural display cases. The Mexican government and the archaeological team made a decision. They agreed with Victor Segovia Pinto. They set up high-resolution 3D scanners inside the tight chambers. They mapped the exact geometry of every plate, every grinding stone, and every incense burner. They built a complete digital replica of Balamku for researchers to study above ground. The physical objects were left alone. The modern teams packed up their scanners and crawled backward through the 16-inch tunnels. The entrance was closed and secured. The ceramic rain gods are still sitting on the limestone floor in the absolute dark, covered in white calcite, exactly where they were left 1,000 years ago. Number 5. The sealed uranium chambers of Gabon. In May 1972, a technician at a French nuclear facility called Pierre Latte was running a routine mass spectrometry test on a piece of uranium ore. The ore had just arrived on a cargo ship from a commercial mine in Oklo, Gabon, on the west coast of Africa. In normal natural uranium, the concentration of the fissile isotope U-235 is exactly 0.72%. You can pull a rock of uranium out of a mountain in Colorado, or the crust of the moon, or a meteorite, and the isotope ratio will consistently read 0.72%. The sample from Gabon read 0.717%. This is the Oklo mine. It houses a natural nuclear reactor that turned itself on 2 billion years ago. A missing chunk of fissile material usually triggers an immediate hunt for a security breach. The French Atomic Energy Commission audited the records from the African mine and calculated that, based on that tiny missing fraction spread across the yield, roughly 200 kilograms of U-235 were unaccounted for. That is enough material to build half a dozen nuclear weapons. The authorities immediately assumed they were dealing with a massive theft. They sent investigators down to the mine in Gabon to track the missing uranium. They tracked the discrepancy to a geological anomaly that had been sitting quietly in the dirt for 2 billion years. The rock at Oklo was a natural nuclear fission reactor. 2 billion years ago, the concentration of U-235 in the Earth's crust was much higher, around 3%, which is roughly the same grade of enriched fuel used in modern nuclear power plants today. A rich vein of uranium requires a moderator to start a sustained chain reaction. A moderator is an element that slows down the free neutrons bouncing off the splitting atoms, allowing them to actually hit other atoms and keep the nuclear fire burning. In a modern power plant, engineers use heavy water or graphite rods to do this. At Oklo, the moderator was just ordinary groundwater. 2 billion years ago, oxygen was just starting to build up in the Earth's atmosphere thanks to early cyanobacteria. That oxygen allowed uranium to dissolve in surface water and sink down through the porous sandstone, concentrating in thick, heavy seams at the bottom of a geological basin. Eventually, groundwater seeped down and pooled around those heavy seams. The water slowed the neutrons down. The uranium began to crackle and heat up, triggering a sustained nuclear chain reaction underground. It was a functioning nuclear power plant built entirely by geology. It operated a lot like a geyser. The groundwater triggered the fission, which generated massive amounts of heat. Once the rock reached a few hundred degrees, the water boiled off into steam. When the water vanished, the fast-moving neutrons missed their targets, and the chain reaction choked to a halt. The rock cooled off over a few thousand years. New groundwater trickled back into the cavern, and the reactor switched back on. This natural engine cycled on and off, boiling and cooling for roughly 300,000 years. The French engineers spent the next few decades mapping the site. They eventually located 16 distinct natural reactor zones spread deep across the Oklo deposit. The French government still needed uranium for their own heavily engineered power plants, so they kept mining the surrounding area. They extracted tons of ore from the standard geological veins, but they recognized exactly how strange and scientifically valuable the active zones were. They cordoned off the fossilized reactor chambers from the heavy machinery, leaving the burned-out cores inside the rock. The site became a crucial study ground for physicists. Modern scientists used Oklo to prove that radioactive waste can be safely contained in geology, because the radioactive byproducts of the Oklo reactors, elements like plutonium and cesium, had stayed locked in the exact same inches of rock for 2 billion years. By 1999, the commercial uranium in the Oklo mine was finally exhausted. The French mining company packed up their equipment, When the operation shut down, they deliberately sealed the remaining natural reactor zones. They poured thick concrete walls to block the access shafts. They collapsed the main tunnels leading into the fossilized chambers. Then, they shut off the massive industrial pumps that kept the mine dry and allowed the deep groundwater to naturally flood the lower levels of the dig. The goal was to lock away the ancient radioactive byproducts and permanently close the site to the outside world. The water that originally started the chain reaction 2 billion years ago finally swallowed it again. The 16 chambers are still down there at the bottom of the flooded mine, sealed behind concrete and sunken rock, a natural engine resting quietly in the dark. Number 6. The sealed tomb of Emperor Jingdi's attendants. In 1990, construction crews were bulldozing a stretch of land just outside the city of Xi'an, laying the groundwork for a new highway to the local airport. The heavy machinery scraped away the topsoil and tore into a series of long, shallow trenches. The workers stopped the tractors and climbed down into the dirt. The broken earth was packed with thousands of small, naked human bodies. They were made of fired clay, each one about 2 feet tall, and they were all missing their arms. The road crew had cut directly into the outer burial pits of Hanyang Ling, the massive necropolis of Emperor Jing. He ruled the Han dynasty from 157 to 141 BC. Jingdi preferred miniatures. He commissioned a sprawling underground compound covering nearly 8 square miles, packed with over 80 individual burial trenches. The pits spread out from a central burial mound, like the spokes of a wheel, organized to mimic the different administrative departments of the imperial government. The compound was essentially a subterranean city, featuring underground kitchens, armories, and stables, all stocked with tiny supplies for the afterlife. The clay figures packed into the soil were his royal attendants. There were thousands of them, representing soldiers, eunuchs, court officials, and maids, all lined up in neat rows. The figures were built without solid limbs by design. The Han craftsmen mass-produced the ceramic torsos and heads, painting the faces with delicate details to differentiate the ranks. They left large circular holes at the shoulders. The arms were carved separately out of wood and attached to the clay bodies with small wooden pins. This allowed the joints to pivot so the servants could be posed holding tiny bronze swords, agricultural tools, or the reins of miniature chariots. Once the arms were pinned in place, the figures were dressed in tailored silk robes to cover the joints. They were placed in the timber-lined trenches, surrounded by thousands of equally tiny clay pigs, dogs, and sheep, and then sealed underground. The soil around Xi'an is a fine, wind-blown sediment called loess, which holds moisture tightly. Over the next 2,000 years, that damp earth broke down the cellular structure of everything organic in the tomb. The heavy wooden ceiling beams supporting the trenches rotted and collapsed, crushing the figures under tons of mud. The tiny wooden arms decayed entirely. The silk garments disintegrated, merging chemically with the surrounding dirt. The only thing that survived the damp was the fired ceramic. The road crews broke the seal on the trenches to find an army of armless, naked dolls trapped in the collapsed soil. Archaeologists quickly took over the site. They started excavating the figures, pulling a few thousand out to study the manufacturing techniques. They found traces of the original paint still clinging to the clay faces. They also found microscopic fibers in the soil, marking exactly where the silk robes had degraded into the earth. When a brush cleared the dirt away from a clay torso, it was often brushing away the decomposed remains of the garments themselves. The teams realized the exposure was destroying the site. The trenches had reached a stable state of equilibrium underground. Opening them to the dry surface, air caused the dirt to rapidly lose moisture. The loess started cracking and flaking, taking the last surviving traces of paint and organic residue with it. Continuing to dig meant erasing the final microscopic evidence of how the figures were clothed and colored. The Chinese Cultural Heritage Authorities halted the excavation. They decided to leave the vast majority of the 80 burial pits entirely unexcavated. They ordered the exposed trenches to be resealed to stabilize the humidity and protect the remaining artifacts. They built the Hanyang Ling Museum directly over the excavation site, creating a permanent barrier between the ancient dirt and the modern air. Engineers laid down thick panels of suspended glass flooring right over the open trenches. They installed an industrial climate control system underneath the walkways. The machinery maintains a strict, unvarying microclimate down in the pits, pumping in heavy moisture to hold the relative humidity near 90%. The glass itself is treated to block ultraviolet light, so the surviving pigments don't bleach out. The public walks over the reinforced glass in a normal air-conditioned room, looking straight down into the separated environment below. The lighting is kept deliberately low to prevent algae growth on the clay. The remaining thousands of clay servants are still down there, in the damp dark, armless and half buried in the dirt, exactly where the collapsed roofs left them. Number 7. The Sealed Salt Mine, Mummies of Iran. In the winter of 1993, a commercial mining crew was operating heavy machinery inside the Chehrabad salt mine in northwestern Iran. A bulldozer cut into a thick vein of rock salt, and the blade snagged on something buried in the wall. The operator stopped the machine and climbed down to check the obstruction. Sticking out of the shattered salt seam was a severed human head. It had long white hair, a thick beard, and a gold earring glinting in the dirt. The salt mine had been active for centuries. The geology of Chehrabad is essentially a giant dome of pure sodium chloride shoved up through the Earth's crust. Salt is a desiccant. It pulls moisture out of anything it touches aggressively. When organic material is buried in it, the salt dehydrates the tissue faster than bacteria can break it down, locking the cells in a mummified state. The Iranian authorities brought in archaeologists to carefully extract the head. They dug further into the seam and pulled out a leather boot with the foot and lower leg still inside it, plus 3 iron knives, a silver needle, a pair of wool trousers, and a few pieces of broken pottery. The man had a fractured skull. Carbon dating put him around 300 AD during the Sasanian Empire. The researchers figured he was a lone miner who had been crushed in a localized cave-in and naturally preserved by the environment. It was a fascinating, isolated find. The commercial mining company eventually went back to work, pulling salt out of the mountain. 11 years later, in 2004, the bulldozers hit another body. This one was further down in the mine. The crew stopped work. The archaeologists came back, and they pulled out the mummified remains of a second man. A few months later, they found a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The bodies were separated by massive chunks of rock and hundreds of years of history. Saltman 4, a 16-year-old boy, found crushed flat with his hands over his face, died around 400 BC during the Achaemenid Empire. Saltman 3 died sometime around the same era. The first guy they found, with the white beard, died 700 years after the teenager did. The Chehrabad mine wasn't a burial ground. It was an active industrial site that had experienced catastrophic collapses repeatedly over 1,000 years, swallowing entire crews of miners in different centuries and preserving them all perfectly in the same geologic dome. The level of preservation was staggering. The salt had tanned their skin like leather. It kept their internal organs intact. Researchers found tapeworm eggs in the intestines of one of the men, proving he had been eating raw or undercooked meat before the ceiling fell on him. The salt preserved the dye in their woolen clothes, revealing bright reds and blues that usually rot away in normal soil. It even preserved the expressions on their faces. By 2007, the excavation teams had pulled 6 separate mummies out of the salt. The commercial mining operations were ripping through the very seams where the bodies were trapped. Every time a bulldozer cut a new tunnel, they risked destroying a perfectly preserved piece of the ancient world. The Iranian government made a decision. They revoked the commercial mining permit entirely. They ordered the bulldozers out, shut down the extraction operation, and declared the entire Chehrabad salt dome a protected archaeological site. But they didn't keep digging. Extracting a mummy from a solid block of rock salt is incredibly destructive. The salt bonds with the tissue, and chiseling the rock away often splinters the bone and tears the skin. When the archaeologists pulled Saltman 4 out of the wall, he came out in pieces, requiring massive stabilization work in the lab. The researchers also knew that once a body was pulled out of the mine, it was exposed to fluctuations in humidity and temperature that the salt dome naturally controlled. The archaeological teams ran ground-penetrating radar across the unexcavated walls of the mine. The scans showed multiple anomalies buried deep in the salt seams. They estimated there were several more bodies, perhaps dozens, still trapped in the rock where they died. The teams decided the safest place for the remaining miners was exactly where they were. They left the anomalies in the wall. They packed up their tools, walked out of the tunnels, and sealed the mine to both commercial extraction and further archaeological digging. The site is now locked down, monitored to prevent looting and to keep the internal climate stable. The 6 excavated bodies are in climate-controlled museum cases in Tehran and Zanjan, but the rest of them are still in the mountain. The salt dome sits closed in the Iranian desert, the seams undisturbed, the dead miners suspended in the rock. Number 8. The sealed chamber of the Great Pyramid. In 1993, a German robotics engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink carried a small, custom-built machine into the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The machine was named Upwat 2. It was essentially a miniature tank, equipped with a camera, a laser pointer, and rubber treads. Gantenbrink inserted the robot into a square shaft, cut into the southern wall of the chamber. The shaft was only 8 inches wide. Upwat 2 crawled upward, at a steep 40-degree angle, grinding its treads against solid limestone. It climbed for 200 feet through the dark core of the monument. Then its camera bumped into a smooth slab of stone. The slab blocked the entire tunnel. Sticking out of the center of this stone block were 2 small, heavily corroded copper pins. It was a door fitted perfectly into the shaft, deep inside the rock. The Great Pyramid was built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BC. The structure contains roughly 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. Inside the pyramid, branching off from the Queen's Chamber, 2 incredibly narrow tunnels point diagonally up toward the sky. The ancient builders constructed these shafts as symbolic pathways for the king's soul to travel through. They aimed them like highly engineered launch pads at specific star systems. The builders walled them off, on both ends, with solid masonry. An engineer in 1872 only discovered their existence by tapping on the smooth chamber wall and investigating a hollow echo behind the stone. The shafts are only 8 inches across. No human being has ever crawled inside them. They sat entirely undisturbed until Gantenbrink drove his robot up the incline and caught the copper pins on his camera feed. The pins were essentially door handles, oxidized green with age. The discovery started a massive debate over what sat behind the slab. The Egyptian authorities spent nearly a decade arguing over the mechanics of getting past the block without shattering it. They eventually permitted a new team to drill a tiny surgical hole straight through the limestone to look at the other side. In 2011, a project called the GD mission arrived in the Queen's Chamber. They sent a new robot up the shaft, carrying a custom drill bit and a fiber optic snake camera. The machine bored through the rock and slipped the camera through the gap. The micro lens twisted around in the absolute dark and illuminated a small empty space. The floor of this tiny hidden chamber was painted with red hieroglyphs. The symbols were red ochre, mason's marks. They were instructions left by the work crews who hauled the blocks into place 4,500 years ago. The camera also panned straight ahead. It immediately found the reason the space was empty. Just a few inches behind the first door sat a second solid limestone block. It was another door, sealing the shaft completely. The second door permanently stopped the robots. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities strictly limits how many holes anyone can bore into the Great Pyramid. The physical exploration of the shafts hit a dead end at that second wall. Physicists decided to look straight through the stone without drilling at all. In 2015, an international team called Scan Pyramids set up heavy detector plates inside the lower corridors of the monument. They were hunting for muons. Muons are heavy subatomic particles created when cosmic rays hit the Earth's atmosphere. They rain down constantly, passing harmlessly through open air, buildings, and human bodies. When they hit solid stone, they slow down and scatter. The detector plates act like photographic film catching these particles. If a detector picks up a high concentration of muons hitting one specific spot, it means there is less stone above it blocking the rain. The process is essentially a dental X-ray, scaled up for a 6 million ton tomb. The plates sat in the dark for months, quietly collecting particle strikes. The researchers retrieved the plates and sent the data to a lab in Japan for analysis. The physicists found a massive spike in muon strikes coming from the center of the pyramid, directly above a vast sloped hallway called the Grand Gallery. The data outlined a completely hidden void. It was at least 100 feet long, with a cross-section roughly the same size as a commercial passenger airplane. The void sits isolated in the core of the monument, completely disconnected from any known hallway. There are no corridors leading to it. The ancient engineers constructed the massive void, sealed the heavy limestone blocks around it, and simply left it in the dark. Egyptologists still argue over its purpose. Some claim it is a grand, untouched burial chamber. Others argue it is a structural relieving chamber, an empty space specifically designed to keep the crushing weight of the rocks above from collapsing the Grand Gallery below. Either way, there is no physical access point. Exploring the void would require dismantling a section of the Great Pyramid with heavy machinery, or drilling a massive borehole through hundreds of feet of ancient limestone. The Egyptian authorities chose the structural integrity of the monument over the contents of the void. They left the stones exactly where Khufu's engineers placed them. The second door in the narrow shaft is still locked. The red paint is still sitting untouched behind it. The massive void above the gallery remains entirely empty of visitors waiting in the dark. Number 9. The sealed bog bodies of Northern Europe. In May of 1950, two brothers named Viggo and Emil Højgaard were cutting peat in a swamp in central Denmark to heat their family stove. Their spades sank through the wet moss and scraped against something soft. They cleared the black mud away and found a human face staring back at them from the dirt. The features were completely intact. The eyes were lightly closed, the eyebrows were distinct, and the short stubble on the chin was perfectly preserved. The brothers assumed they had just uncovered a recent murder victim. They left the swamp and called the local police. The police arrived, looked at the braided leather rope pulled tight around the dead man's neck, and called a museum. The brothers had uncovered Toland Man. He was an Iron Age sacrifice who had been strangled and dropped into the water roughly 2,400 years ago. The bogs of Northern Europe operate like natural chemical vats. The swamps are packed with sphagnum moss. When that moss dies and decays in the cold water, it releases a highly acidic compound called sphagnum. The acid actively binds to the calcium in human bones, dissolving the skeleton to the consistency of rubber. At the same time, the freezing, oxygen-deprived water prevents natural bacteria from surviving. The bog essentially functions as a massive, naturally occurring tannery. It treats human tissue the exact same way a leatherworker treats cowhide. The acid turns the skin, hair, and internal organs into thick, dark leather before rot can set in. Toland Man is the most famous example of this chemistry, but peat cutters have pulled hundreds of these bodies out of the wetlands across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Ireland. The level of preservation allows forensic pathologists to run modern autopsies on people who died during the Roman Empire. Researchers can lift the leathered stomachs out of the abdominal cavities and sequence the exact ingredients of their final meals. Toland Man ate a porridge of barley, flax, and knotweed just a few hours before the rope went around his neck. The physical evidence outlines a pattern of deliberate, highly organized violence. The bodies were frequently pinned to the bottom of the swamps, with heavy, crossed wooden branches woven into the mud. The killers wanted to ensure the dead stayed underwater. Many of the victims suffered from extreme overkill. Another body found nearby. Grobal Man had his throat slashed from ear to ear so deeply, the cut severed his esophagus. Lindo Man, found in an English bog, was struck in the head with an axe, strangled with a knotted cord, and then had his throat cut before he was thrown into the water. These were ritual offerings, fed directly to the wetlands by the local communities. For centuries, the only people finding these offerings were local farmers, cutting small bricks of peat by hand. A shovel might slice through a leathered arm, but the damage was contained. Then modern industrial peat harvesting arrived. Companies deployed massive mechanical excavators to tear through the swamps, churning up tons of moss a day to sell as cheap fuel and garden fertilizer. The heavy machinery began shredding the ancient bodies. A steel rotary blade easily cuts through tanned skin, scattering the remains across conveyor belts before the operators ever notice a face in the dirt. The European archaeological authorities realized that commercial harvesting was rapidly erasing an entire demographic of the Iron Age. Excavating every single bog by hand to save the bodies was logistically impossible. The wetlands cover thousands of square miles. The only way to protect the remaining sacrifices was to freeze the geography in place. Several governments stepped in, drew boundaries around the most historically dense ritual swamps, and legally banned all peat cutting. They revoked the industrial permits and ordered the excavators off the moss. The sites were permanently sealed to both commercial fuel companies and the public. The environmental chemistry that preserved Tollund Man relies entirely on the water table remaining undisturbed. Pulling the bodies out of the ground exposes the tissue to the oxygen that the bog successfully held off for 2 millennia. The modern conservation strategy is simply to leave the chemistry alone. The protected bogs sit quietly under the gray sky, untouched. The unexcavated sacrifices are still pinned under the mud in the freezing water, their skin tanned black, waiting in the dark. Number 10. The Sealed Antechamber of Sipan. In February of 1987, a group of local grave robbers dug a hole into an eroded mud brick pyramid near the small town of Sipan in northern Peru. The looters, known locally as huaqueros, were looking for marketable ceramics to sell to private collectors. They hit a royal tomb instead. The robbers pulled out massive gold masks, silver beads, and heavy copper jewelry, stuffing the artifacts into grain sacks in the dark. A few days later, the local police noticed a sudden influx of ancient gold moving through the regional black market. People were quietly trying to sell priceless pre-Columbian artifacts out of their living rooms. Officers raided the pyramid at night. The looters fired back, turning a quiet dirt mound into a brief gunfight over buried treasure. One looter died in the exchange. The rest scattered into the desert, and the police secured the crater. The authorities called in a Peruvian archaeologist named Walter Alva to inspect the damage. Alva arrived to find the mud pyramid chewed apart by shovels. The robbers had breached the upper levels of a massive burial complex belonging to the Moche culture. The Moche ruled the northern coast of Peru roughly 1,000 years before the Inca existed. They were a desert society that built massive irrigation canals and constructed enormous artificial mountains out of millions of sun-dried mud bricks. They buried their elite leadership inside these solid structures. Those leaders were warrior priests, heavily decorated, and sent into the afterlife with an overwhelming amount of wealth. The looters had emptied one chamber, leaving a jagged pit in the mud brick. Alva noticed the soil composition beneath the looted room. The stratigraphy, the distinct undisturbed layers of packed earth, suggested the platform went much deeper. The robbers had merely scraped the ceiling of the real complex. Alva and his team set up a 24-hour guarded perimeter to keep the huaqueros out. They started digging slowly down through the floor of the robbed tomb. A few yards below the destruction, they hit an entirely undisturbed burial chamber. They found a wooden sarcophagus bound in heavy copper straps. Inside, it was a man they eventually named the Lord of Sipan. He was covered head to toe in gold, silver, and turquoise ornaments. He wore headdresses hammered into the shapes of crescent moons, a solid gold face mask, and a heavy necklace made of individual gold and silver beads shaped like peanuts. The Moche made sure their lord didn't travel into the afterlife alone. The archaeologists found 6 other bodies buried in the dirt around the sarcophagus. They were guards, servants, and concubines, all sacrificed to attend the priest in the dark. The Moche took specific anatomical precautions to ensure the guards actually stayed at their posts. The archaeologists excavating the skeletal remains of the sentries found the leg bones ended abruptly at the ankles. The burial party had cleanly amputated the feet of the guards before laying them in the mud bricks, ensuring they couldn't physically walk away from the Lord in the underworld. The team spent months carefully extracting the Lord of Sipan and his crippled sentries. They mapped the precise location of every turquoise bead before lifting it from the soil. They cataloged the gold, treated the rotting copper, and moved the remains to a highly secure museum built specifically to hold them. The mud brick platform was vast, measuring hundreds of feet across. Radar and soil analysis indicated the pyramid held dozens of other antechambers and deeper tombs reaching down into the bedrock. The archaeological team faced a severe logistical problem. Fully excavating the entire complex would take decades and millions of dollars they did not have. Leaving open half-dug pits in the Peruvian desert would essentially serve as an invitation for the local looters to come back with heavier equipment. A partially excavated gold tomb is a highly visible, unprotected bank vault. The Peruvian authorities made a defensive choice. They documented the layout of the lower anomalies, then systematically backfilled the excavation trenches with tons of sifted earth. They poured thick concrete caps over the vulnerable access points to physically block any future shovels. They established a permanent armed police garrison directly on top of the ruins, assigning officers to watch the desert for trespassers round the clock. The government declared the rest of the mud pyramid permanently closed to both looters and archaeologists. The deepest antechambers are still down there, under the reinforced dirt, holding their own lords and their own footless guards. Number 11. The Sealed Ice Cave of Ötzi. In September of 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were walking off the marked trail in the Ötztal Alps, right near the border of Austria and Italy. They were crossing a high mountain pass at 10,000 feet. Helmut noticed a brown shape sticking out of a narrow meltwater gully in the glacial ice. It was the back of a human head and a pair of bare, leathery shoulders. The skin looked like wet wax. The hikers assumed they had found a modern mountaineer who took a bad step a decade earlier. The Austrian police treated the site like a routine modern recovery. They flew in a mountain rescue team. The crew used ski poles, heavy ice axes, and a pneumatic jackhammer to crack the frozen meltwater. They accidentally drilled into the body's left hip and snapped his left arm, trying to lever him out of the ice. They shoved him into a plastic body bag, transferred him to a wooden coffin, and drove him to a morgue in Innsbruck. Then an archaeologist looked at the items the police had pulled out of the ice alongside the body. The dead man carried a small axe with a solid copper blade. He had a flint dagger with a woven ashwood handle, a bearskin hat, a woven grass cloak, and a quiver holding 14 arrows. He was a 5,300-year-old traveler from the Copper Age. The man became known as Ötzi, the Iceman. The glacier had completely freeze-dried his body, turning him into one of the most perfectly preserved human specimens on Earth. The ice kept his brain tissue intact. It preserved his stomach and the ibex meat he ate for his final meal. It also preserved a Copper Age crime scene. In 2001, a radiologist named Paul Gossner ran a new X-ray scan across the chest cavity. The scan revealed an inch-long flint arrowhead buried deep in Ötzi's left shoulder. Someone shot him from behind. The arrow tore through his subclavian artery, bleeding him out into the snow in a matter of minutes. The attacker walked up to the body, grabbed the wooden arrow shaft, and snapped it off, leaving the stone tip embedded in the muscle. Forensic analysis found a deep, jagged cut across Ötzi's right hand, slicing down to the bone. It was a fresh defensive wound. He had survived a close-quarters knife fight a few days earlier, hiked up to 10,000 feet, and then taken an arrow to the back. The ice locked the blood and the torn tissue in place for 5 millennia. The specific rocky gully where Ötzi fell acted like a natural protective trench. A heavy snow filled the depression and buried him before any scavengers could reach the body. Then the massive Alpine glacier advanced over the top of the trench. The ice formed a solid ceiling above him, flowing over the rock and leaving his bones entirely intact. He sat in that sealed natural freezer until the modern climate warmed enough to melt the top layer of the glacier and expose his shoulders. Today, that specific stretch of the Alps is heavily monitored. As the glacial melt accelerates, archaeologists continuously survey the receding ice around the gully, pulling up fragments of his snowshoes and bits of animal hide that the 1991 jackhammers missed. But the most intense sealing process happened to Ötzi himself. Putting a wet, frozen 5,000-year-old body into a room temperature lab initiates rapid bacterial rot. To stop him from decaying, the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Italy built him a custom artificial glacier. They sealed Ötzi inside a highly engineered refrigerated cell. The chamber simulates the exact environmental conditions of the ice pack where he spent his death. The room is completely dark. The temperature is locked at 21 degrees Fahrenheit. The relative humidity is held at almost 100%. The air inside the chamber passes through a sterile filtration system to remove airborne bacteria and fungal spores. The room is rigged with backup generators and secondary cooling systems designed to take over instantly if the primary unit fails. A frost-free freezer pulls moisture out of the air, and over time, it would slowly dehydrate his tissues, turning him to dust. To stop this, the chamber features an automated nozzle system. A machine regularly sprays his leathery skin with a fine mist of sterilized water. The water freezes on contact, building a thin, protective layer of fresh ice across his entire body. He is encased in a frozen shell that essentially serves as his new skin. Visitors and researchers examine him through a small, thick viewing window. The medical teams only open the heavy insulated door when a tissue sample is absolutely required, and they drop the temperature of the adjoining laboratory to match the cell before they do. Ötzi lies flat on a sterile surgical table behind the glass, sealed in his artificial ice cave. The copper axe the police pulled from the mountain sits in a climate-controlled case next to him. Number 12. The Sealed Necropolis of Saqqara. In September of 2020, an Egyptian archaeological team was standing over a deep vertical shaft cut directly into the bedrock at Saqqara. They lowered a light into the 30-foot drop. The bottom of the pit was stacked with solid wooden sarcophagi. The team rigged a winch system and began hauling the heavy boxes up to the surface. The wood was completely intact, and the hieroglyphs on the lids were painted in bright reds, blues, and gold. The Egyptian workers had just opened a sealed cache containing 27 untouched coffins. Saqqara served as the primary burial ground for the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis for over 3,000 years. The landscape is dominated by the step pyramid of Djoser, but the desert floor surrounding it is essentially a massive honeycomb of subterranean burial shafts. For decades, archaeologists assumed the most accessible pits had been stripped clean by tomb robbers centuries ago. The team digging in 2020 was working in an area known as the Bubastion, a precinct traditionally associated with the worship of Bastet, the cat goddess. They were looking for animal mummies. Instead, they hit a solid wall of human burials. The initial 27 coffins were just the first layer. The team kept clearing the sand and found more shafts branching off the main pit. By November of that same year, the count of sealed, perfectly preserved coffins had climbed to over 100. The burials belonged to priests, senior officials, and elites of the late period, roughly 2,500 years ago. The shafts had been deliberately filled with sand and rubble by the ancient mortuary priests immediately after the coffins were lowered into place. That packed sand created a tight environmental seal. It choked off the oxygen and kept the wood dry, preventing the paint from flaking and the timber from rotting. The coffins were stacked almost haphazardly on top of each other, filling the chambers to the ceiling. Some of the coffins were opened on site for the international press. The archaeologists broke the ancient resin seals and lifted the wooden lids to reveal mummies still wrapped tightly in pristine linen, wearing gilded burial masks. But the sheer volume of the discovery created an immediate logistical crisis for the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. 100 wooden sarcophagi require an enormous amount of physical space. They also require immediate climate stabilization once they are pulled out of their 3,000-year-old sand vault. The Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo was still under construction, and the existing museum facilities were already severely overcrowded. The conservation teams could only handle a fraction of the newly exposed wood at any given time. The lead archaeologists made a pragmatic choice. They extracted the most ornate coffins and the most historically significant mummies to transfer to the museum laboratories. They documented the hieroglyphs, ran X-rays on the remains, and cataloged the names of the dead. Then they stopped pulling boxes out of the ground. They left the remaining, less ornate coffins exactly where they found them, stacked in the dark at the bottom of the limestone shafts. The workers hauled the heavy dirt and rubble back to the edge of the pits and began shoveling it back in. They systematically backfilled the burial shafts, burying the unexcavated coffins under tons of sand once again. They poured a protective concrete cap over the top of the shafts to seal the site from the modern surface. The strategy relies on the earth to do the preservation work. The sand held the wood together for 2.5 millennia, and the archaeologists decided it was the safest place to keep the artifacts until the country had the laboratory space to properly handle them. The Egyptian government announced the massive find, displayed the highlights, and then quietly closed the door. The necropolis is currently an active dig site, but the specific shafts found in the fall of 2020 are resealed. Dozens of brightly painted wooden boxes are still sitting at the bottom of the pits, covered in dirt, waiting for someone to drop a light down the hole a second time. Number 13. The Sealed Vaults of Padmanabhaswamy Temple. In the summer of 2011, a 7-member committee appointed by the Supreme Court of India walked into the dark stone corridors of the Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Kerala. They carried heavy iron crowbars, flashlights, and a legal mandate to run an inventory. Their job was to document the contents of the temple's underground storage rooms. They broke the rusted iron padlocks on a subterranean chamber designated in the records as Vault A. They swung the heavy wooden doors open, stepped inside, and hit a solid wall of gold. The room was packed with centuries of untouched royal offerings. The Padmanabhaswamy Temple is a massive, heavily fortified complex dedicated to the Hindu deity Vishnu, sitting in the center of Thiruvananthapuram. For hundreds of years, the royal family of Travancore managed the site. The kings and the local nobility treated the temple as a divine bank vault. They regularly deposited unimaginable wealth into the underground chambers as offerings. Whenever a new Maharaja took the throne, the family would weigh the king on a massive scale and donate his exact body weight in solid gold to the temple. A steady stream of gold coins, diamonds, and silver statues went down into the dark and stayed there. The royal family kept the inventory entirely off the public books, guarding the vaults with temple priests and thick stone walls. By 2011, a local lawyer filed a petition demanding transparency regarding the temple's hidden assets, prompting the Supreme Court to force an audit. The legal mandate was basically an accounting exercise that accidentally uncovered one of the largest treasure hoards in human history. The committee spent weeks hauling items out of Vault A and 4 other underground rooms. They worked in the stifling heat, cataloging artifacts that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. They found solid gold thrones studded with hundreds of diamonds, designed to hold a small deity. They dragged out heavy canvas sacks filled with Roman coins from the year 114 BC, Venetian ducats, and Napoleonic currency. They uncovered a 3.5-foot tall solid gold idol of Vishnu, ceremonial chains weighing nearly 40 pounds, and emeralds the size of apples. The initial estimates placed the value of the 5 open vaults at roughly $22 billion. It was enough physical wealth to single-handedly shift the economic metrics of the surrounding state. The committee eventually reached the 6th room. It was listed in the auditing records as Vault B. They found a heavy wooden door. They unlocked it, only to find a solid iron door sitting immediately behind it. This second door was a completely smooth sheet of metal, with no exposed hinges and no visible keyholes. It was bolted shut from the inside, framed by heavy iron pillars. Carved directly into the metal of the door were the figures of two massive cobras. The temple priests and the royal family stepped in. They explained that Vault B was the sacred undisturbed home of the deity's wealth, protected by a specific ritual seal called a Nagapasam, or serpent binding. Temple tradition dictated that the door was locked by ancient acoustic chants, and that opening it by physical force would trigger a catastrophic curse. They warned that breaking the iron would bring disaster to the entire state of Kerala. The committee brought the issue back to the Supreme Court. The legal argument essentially pitted modern state auditing laws against ancient ritual locks. The royal family argued that the serpent carvings were a hard boundary, placed there centuries ago to ensure no human being ever crossed the threshold. The sheer volume of wealth pulled from the other 5 rooms only amplified the speculation about what was sitting behind the snakes. If the secondary vaults held $22 billion in overflow, the primary, heavily fortified sacred vault could theoretically hold double that. The Supreme Court listened to the temple authorities. They issued a permanent stay on the audit of the final room. They allowed the government to catalog, secure, and photograph the gold sitting in the open vaults. They ordered military-grade security perimeters built around the temple complex. The state installed blast-proof doors, hundreds of security cameras, and deployed armed commandos to protect the recovered assets. They legally barred anyone from touching the iron door. The Supreme Court audit ended in the Aiza corridor outside. Vault B is still closed, sitting in the dark. The cobra is still guarding whatever is bolted behind the iron. Number 14. The Sealed Cave of Altamira. In the summer of 1879, an amateur archaeologist named Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola was digging in the dirt floor of a cave in northern Spain looking for ancient stone tools. His 8-year-old daughter, Maria, wandered away from his trench into a side chamber. The limestone ceiling was low, so she looked up. She called out to her father, pointing at the rock, telling him there were oxen painted in the dark. Marcelino held up his lantern and saw a herd of life-sized bison, horses, and deer stretching across the ceiling. The animals were painted in heavy charcoal and bright red ochre. The artist had deliberately incorporated the natural bulges and cracks of the limestone into the painting, giving the bison 3-dimensional shoulders and haunches. Marcelino had found Altamira. He published a small booklet on the discovery, proposing the art was made by Paleolithic humans. The academic establishment immediately accused him of running a scam. In 1880, the dominant historical consensus held that early humans were brutish and entirely incapable of abstract, multicolored artistic expression. The leading experts in France publicly declared the paintings a crude hoax. They accused Marcelino of hiring a contemporary painter to forge the bison just to gain fame. Marcelino died in 1888, completely discredited. It took another 14 years for the critics to discover identical cave art in France, realize their error, and admit the Altamira paintings were authentic. The pigment on the ceiling is roughly 36,000 years old. By the mid-20th century, Altamira was famous. People called it the Sistine Chapel of prehistoric art. The regional authorities built infrastructure around the entrance and opened the heavy wooden doors to the public. By the 1970s, up to 1,500 tourists were walking into the cavern every single day. They brought the exact same thermodynamic problem that was quietly destroying Lascaux across the border in France. 1,500 people, trapped in a small, unventilated stone tube, exhale massive amounts of carbon dioxide and water vapor. Their body heat disrupts the ambient temperature. The heavy moisture condensed directly onto the cold ceiling, mixing with the ancient binder and slowly dissolving the pigment. The 36,000-year-old paint began to literally wash off the rock. The electric lights installed for the tourists fed a sudden explosion of green mold and airborne bacteria across the bison. The visitors were dissolving the ceiling just by standing under it. The Spanish government completely closed the site in 1977. They locked the doors and let the cave sit in the dark for 5 years, trying to stabilize the internal climate. In 1982, they tried a limited reopening, letting in just 40 visitors a day. It didn't work. The bacteria had already established a firm foothold in the porous rock. Any new influx of human heat and moisture triggered fresh biological growth. In 2002, researchers detected a new spread of green algae over the central paintings. The Ministry of Culture closed the original cave entirely. They followed the French model of preservation by substitution. The government built a massive, highly engineered concrete replica nearby, mapping the original ceiling with lasers and hiring artists to duplicate the ochre strokes perfectly. They opened the replica to the massive crowds, diverting the tourism money away from the fragile original. For over a decade, Altamira sat completely sealed. Then, in 2014, the authorities instituted a carefully engineered lottery system to allow a microscopic level of access. Every Friday, out of the thousands of people visiting the replica museum, 5 random visitors are drawn from the crowd. Those 5 winners are taken to a staging room. They are zipped into sterile Tyvek coveralls, fitted with hairnets, surgical masks, and special shoes. A guide leads them through the locked metal door into the original cavern. The visit is timed to the minute. They are allowed exactly 37 minutes inside the cave, under strict instructions on where to step and how to breathe. The timing is calculated to ensure their combined body heat never raises the air temperature by more than a fraction of a degree. When their 37 minutes are up, the guide escorts them out. The heavy door swings shut, the seals are checked, and the bison go back into the dark for another week. Number 15. The Sealed Tomb of Genghis Khan. In the Kentiai Mountains of northern Mongolia, there is a vast stretch of wilderness with no roads, no monuments, and no markers. The only sound is the wind in the pine trees and the movement of a river. According to local historical tradition, that river doesn't belong there. It was deliberately diverted from its natural course in the summer of 1227 to flow directly over a fresh grave. The grave belongs to Genghis Khan. He died commanding an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. When the Khan died during a military campaign in China, his generals faced a massive logistical problem. They needed to transport his body hundreds of miles back to his homeland in Mongolia without letting the subjugated territories know the empire's founder was dead. A dead leader usually meant an immediate armed rebellion, so the burial escort moved entirely in secret. The procession rode out across the steppes, hauling the royal cart toward a sacred mountain called Burkhan Khaldun. They wanted the location permanently erased. According to the chroniclers of the time, the escort slaughtered every single person they crossed paths with during the journey. If a nomad saw the cart, the soldiers killed them to keep the route quiet. When they finally reached the chosen burial site, slaves dug a massive trench. They lowered the Khan into the earth, covered him in dirt, and then drove a herd of 1,000 horses back and forth across the ground to trample it completely flat, to guarantee the slaves couldn't draw a map for future grave robbers. The soldiers simply killed the slaves. Then, to make sure those soldiers couldn't talk, a second group of troops rode out and killed the first group. It was an exceptionally thorough non-disclosure agreement, and just to be absolutely certain, they allegedly dammed the local river. They let the water flood the flattened plain, washing away the final hoofprints and the spilled blood. The tomb was sealed by the landscape itself. For the next 800 years, the region around Burkhan Khaldun became known as the Ich Korig, or the Great Taboo. It was a massive forbidden zone covering roughly 90 square miles of dense forest and mountain terrain. The Mongol Empire posted an elite tribe of warriors called the Dark Hat at the borders. Their only job was to stop anyone from entering the zone. The penalty for trespassing was death. The guards kept watch for generations, passing the duty down from father to son. Even after the empire fell, the taboo held. The Soviet-backed government of the 20th century maintained the closure, They kept the region strictly off-limits to foreigners and locals alike, mostly to prevent Mongolian nationalism from taking root around a historical monument. Today, the land is a highly protected national park. Foreign archaeological teams occasionally propose using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to scan the mountains for the burial chamber. The Mongolian government routinely denies the permits. The resistance isn't just bureaucratic. There is a deep cultural belief in Mongolia that finding the tomb would trigger a global catastrophe. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb of another great conqueror, Timur, in Uzbekistan. 3 days later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, starting the bloodiest conflict in human history. The local population in Mongolia tends to view that as a perfectly clear historical precedent. In the early 2000s, an American expedition called the Genghis Khan Geohistorical Project tried to use non-invasive tools to scan the region. They brought in magnetometers to map the terrain from afar without turning a single shovel of dirt. The project sparked immense public backlash in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. The team was forced to pack up their equipment and leave the country under intense pressure from politicians and citizens who simply wanted the ground left alone. The local authorities actively discourage any organized search. The Ik Korig remains heavily restricted by law. The river still runs over the flattened plain, and the man who conquered half the known world is still missing in his own country. Number 16. The sealed Roman ship Caves of Nemi. In October 1928, engineers working under Benito Mussolini hauled massive industrial water pumps to the edge of a small volcanic crater in the Alban Hills of Italy. They dropped heavy intake pipes directly into Lake Nemi. They switched the engines on and spent the next 4 years slowly pumping billions of gallons of water out of the basin, dropping the water level by over 70 feet. They drained the lake to recover 2 massive wooden ships. The ships belonged to the Roman Emperor Caligula. Around 40 AD, Caligula commissioned 2 floating palaces for his own personal use on this tiny, secluded lake. These were engineering marvels of the ancient world. They measured over 230 feet long, built with flat bottoms to sit in the shallow water. Caligula had them fitted with marble mosaic floors, functioning hot and cold plumbing, and heavy decks planted with live fruit trees. They were essentially massive party villas anchored over a volcanic vent. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, his successors systematically erased his legacy. Scuttling his massive private yachts was a standard piece of administrative cleanup. The Romans stripped the most valuable bronze and marble off the floating palaces, smashed the hulls, and sank them. The ships settled into the thick mud at the bottom of the crater and stayed there for 19 centuries. Local fishermen always knew they were down there. They frequently snagged their nets on the wrecks, pulling up heavily corroded bronze wolf heads and copper nails. Mussolini decided raising the ancient ships would perfectly symbolize the rebirth of the Roman Empire under his fascist regime. The engineering feat required to retrieve them was staggering. As the lake drained, the mud dried and cracked, exposing the massive curved ribs of the hulls. The cold, oxygen-poor mud had preserved the timber almost perfectly. The Roman shipbuilders had originally coated the timber in a layer of wool soaked in pitch, and then nailed thin sheets of lead over the outside to protect the wood from parasites. It was a waterproofing technique that kept the ribs completely intact. The engineers laid down a network of heavy steel rails across the newly dry lake bed. They built heavy wooden cradles under the ancient ships, hooked them up to steam winches, and slowly dragged the massive hulls out of the crater. The government constructed a concrete museum directly on the shore to house them. The Museum of the Roman Ships was an enormous hangar with walls of glass, designed specifically to bathe the ancient wood in natural light. The ships sat in that museum for barely a decade. In late May of 1944, the German army was retreating north through Italy, fighting a series of artillery battles against the advancing Allies. A German anti-aircraft battery set up a position near the lake. On the night of May 31st, a fire broke out inside the museum. Investigators still debate whether it was a stray American artillery shell or deliberate arson by the retreating soldiers. The wooden roof of the building collapsed directly onto the dry, highly flammable ancient timbers. Both of Caligula's ships burned to ash in a matter of hours. 2,000 years of perfect preservation in the mud was erased in a single evening. After the war, the recovery project was entirely abandoned. The massive industrial pumps had been shut off years earlier. Without the machines fighting the natural hydrology of the crater, the underground springs and seasonal rains slowly refilled the basin. The water level crept back up the slopes, swallowing the heavy steel tracks and the excavation trenches. Archaeological surveys of the basin indicate the lakebed likely still holds scattered debris, ancient stone anchors, and potentially the remains of a third smaller ceremonial boat that the 1920s teams never hauled out. The Italian government decided not to drain the lake a second time to find out. The site was quietly surrendered back to the crater. Lake Nemi is completely full today, and the surviving Roman timber is sitting in the mud, under 50 feet of water. Number 17. The Sealed Tunnel of the Feathered Serpent. In the fall of 2003, a massive rainstorm swept over the ancient Mexican city of Teotihuacan. The heavy water carved a 3-foot sinkhole directly into the dirt at the base of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. An archaeologist named Sergio Gomez was called in to inspect the structural damage to the pyramid. He tied a heavy flashlight to a rope and lowered it down the hole. The light cut through the dark and illuminated a perfectly carved vertical shaft intersecting with a massive subterranean tunnel. The ancient inhabitants of Teotihuacan had sealed the entrance roughly 1,800 years ago. They backed out of the tunnel and packed the opening with massive boulders to ensure nobody followed them. Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient Americas, supporting over 100,000 people at its peak, around 400 AD. The culture left behind massive stone pyramids, wide paved avenues, and highly detailed murals, but zero written records. Archaeologists spent decades scraping the surface of the city, pulling up broken pottery and the remains of sacrificed warriors, completely unaware there was a secondary architecture cut into the bedrock beneath their boots. The tunnel Gomez found ran for over 300 feet, directly under the central pyramid. Excavating it was a slow, claustrophobic process. The ancient builders had filled the tunnel with thousands of tons of dirt and rock to deliberately close it off. Gomez and his team spent 12 years carefully removing the rubble. Before sending humans down the unstable shaft, they deployed a small remote-controlled robot equipped with infrared cameras and titanium treads. The machine rolled into the dark and mapped the initial blockages, giving the human excavators a clear path to dig. The human teams worked on their hands and knees, wearing heavy respirators in the damp air. The oxygen levels dropped dangerously low the further they pushed into the rock. They found over 100,000 individual offerings buried in the dirt along the tunnel floor. The ancient priests had systematically deposited greenstone crocodile teeth, jaguar skulls, spheres of pure amber, and heavy rubber balls. They found wooden statues of individuals with bright jade eyes, perfectly preserved by the lack of oxygen. At the very end of the tunnel, 130 feet beneath the apex of the pyramid, the team broke through the final dirt barrier into 3 hidden chambers. The ancient architects had coated the ceiling of these rooms in iron pyrite. Pyrite is a highly reflective metallic mineral. When the researchers shined their flashlights upward, the ceiling caught the beams and sparkled like a starry night sky. The floor below was carved into a miniature landscape of miniature mountains and shallow valleys. In the depressions of those tiny valleys, the priests had poured heavy pools of liquid mercury to represent subterranean lakes. The entire chamber was a scale model of the underworld, built in the absolute dark. The liquid mercury acted like a massive mirror on the floor. The ancient priests would have stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by glowing metal lakes, holding torches that reflected off the pyrite stars above them. It was essentially a functioning planetarium, built entirely out of toxic heavy metals. The excavation team cataloged the artifacts. bagged the amber spheres, and pulled the wooden statues up to the surface laboratories for preservation. The physical structure of the underworld model presented a massive conservation problem. The iron pyrite stars and the liquid mercury lakes survived for 2 millennia because the tunnel operated as a closed system. The heavy boulders at the entrance completely isolated the chambers from modern temperature fluctuations and surface oxygen. Keeping the tunnel open for tourists or ongoing academic research would rapidly degrade the metallic paint, introduce black mold, and evaporate the highly toxic mercury into the air. The physical architecture of the tunnel had no defense against the modern atmosphere. The Mexican authorities made a pragmatic choice to protect the geology. They brought in high-resolution 3D laser scanners to map the exact dimensions of the three chambers and the long access tunnel. They recorded the terrain of the miniature mountains and the exact placement of the pyrite dust. Then, the archaeologists carried their equipment out of the dark. They systematically refilled the access shafts with sifted dirt. They poured a protective stone and concrete cap over the original sinkhole, locking the site down permanently. The miniature mountains and the pools of liquid mercury are still sitting at the end of the tunnel, sealed under the bedrock. Number 18. The sealed underwater cave of Cosquer. In the late summer of 1985, a professional deep-sea diver named Henri Cosquer descended 120 feet into the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Marseille. He swam slowly along the sheer limestone cliffs of Cape Morgiou and found a dark hole carved into the rock. He squeezed his air tanks through the opening and kicked his way into a flooded pitch-black tunnel. The shaft sloped upward for nearly 600 feet through the solid bedrock. Cosquer navigated entirely by the narrow beam of his dive light. He followed the ascending rock until his head broke the surface of an underground lake. He pulled off his mouthpiece and breathed in stale, heavy air. He shined his light at the dry walls of the cavern above the waterline. The rock was covered in dozens of stenciled human hands and charcoal paintings of horses, seals, and great auks. Cosquer had just surfaced inside a Paleolithic art gallery, perfectly preserved at the end of a flooded tube. Around 27,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the Mediterranean sea level sat roughly 400 feet lower than it does today. The entrance to the cave was entirely dry, sitting on a wide, grassy plain several miles from the ocean. Paleolithic hunters walked through the wide mouth of the cavern, built small fires, and painted the coastal wildlife onto the limestone. They used red ochre to stencil their own hands onto the walls, frequently showing fingers missing at the upper joints. As the Ice Age ended, the massive continental glaciers melted. The sea level rose, swallowing the plain and completely submerging the entrance to the cave. The air pocket at the top of the chamber acted exactly like a glass pushed upside down into a bucket of water. The trapped air pressure kept the upper walls completely dry, while the ocean drowned everything in the lower passages. Cosquer knew the archaeological community would immediately lock the site down upon discovery, so he simply kept the 30,000-year-old art gallery to himself. For 6 years, he treated the ancient cavern as his own private museum. He quietly returned to the air pocket by himself, documenting the paintings with waterproof cameras and keeping the location hidden from the French authorities. The entrance remained an unmarked hole on the seabed. Then, in September of 1991, 3 recreational divers found the opening while swimming along the limestone cliffs. They carried only basic open-water scuba gear. They swam directly into the flooded tunnel, relying entirely on their flashlights and their memory of the route to find the way out. A submerged cave floor is covered in thousands of years of accumulated silt. When a diver swims too close to the bottom, the physical motion of their fins kicks up the fine sediment. The 3 amateurs stirred the silt heavily into the water column. The tunnel instantly turned completely opaque. The divers lost their sense of direction in the zero visibility water. They failed to locate the exit shaft in the dark, and they ran out of compressed air inside the rock. When the divers failed to surface, Cosquer realized he had to report the cave. He went to the French Maritime Police, handed over his photographs, and gave them the exact coordinates. The French Navy deployed specialized recovery teams to extract the bodies from the tunnel. The operation required heavy safety tethers and highly trained cave recovery specialists navigating the exact same silt cloud. The government archaeologists reviewed Cosker's footage and confirmed the paintings were authentic. The French Ministry of Culture recognized the site as a priceless, incredibly rare snapshot of Ice Age coastal art. The maritime police simply recognized the tunnel as a perfectly engineered hazard for curious tourists. The authorities decided to physically barricade the cavern. They brought in heavy maritime cranes and lowered massive concrete blocks down through 120 feet of seawater. Navy divers guided the blocks into place, stacking them directly across the mouth of the underwater tunnel. They cemented a heavy iron gate into the remaining gap in the rock, bolting the steel directly into the limestone cliff. The French government strictly controls the keys to that gate. They allow a handful of highly trained scientific divers into the tunnel a few times a year, purely to monitor the structural integrity of the cavern and map. The walls. The researchers are tracking a slow, ongoing collapse. The Mediterranean is still rising by a few millimeters every year. The water inside the sealed cavern is creeping higher up the walls, slowly washing the red ochre handprints off the rock. The heavy concrete blocks at the entrance keep the public out, leaving the ancient seals and horses sitting in the absolute dark, waiting for the water to finish taking them. Number 19. The Sealed Cave of Chauvet. In December of 1994, 3 amateur cavers were hiking through the limestone cliffs of the Ardèche Gorge in southern France. They felt a faint draft of cool air blowing out of a pile of loose rock. They spent hours pulling stones away from the cliff face, eventually exposing a narrow fissure in the rock. They squeezed into the gap, crawled through 30 feet of pitch-black tunnel, and dropped down into a massive limestone chamber. This is Chauvet Cave. The floor was completely covered in the skulls of extinct cave bears. The cavern was massive, stretching for over a quarter of a mile into the mountain. When the cavers swept their flashlights across the walls, they illuminated over 1,000 individual paintings. The ancient artists focused heavily on apex predators. The rock was covered in highly detailed charcoal drawings of cave lions, panthers, woolly rhinoceroses, and hyenas. The artists had actively prepared the limestone before drawing, physically scraping the dark oxidation off the rock to create a bright white canvas. They used stump shading to smudge the charcoal, giving the stampeding rhinos a 3-dimensional depth. The charcoal was eventually carbon dated to roughly 32,000 years ago, making it some of the oldest figurative art on the planet. The preservation of the paint was absolutely flawless. Around 29,000 years ago, the sheer rock face above the original entrance collapsed. Hundreds of tons of limestone sheared off the cliff and buried the mouth of the cave under a solid mountain of rubble. The collapse essentially trapped a piece of the Ice Age inside a geological vault. It locked the temperature at exactly 56 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity at 99%. The heavy rock seal choked off all air currents, leaving the dust completely stationary. When the 3 cavers dropped into the chamber in 1994, they found the footprints of a small child and the paw prints of an ancient wolf perfectly preserved in the soft clay, looking like they had been pressed there an hour earlier. The French Ministry of Culture took control of the site within days. The archaeological authorities had already lived through the massive environmental collapses at Lascaux and Altamira. They had spent the previous decades watching human body heat, electric lights, and the water vapor from tourist breath melt ancient paint and trigger massive fungal outbreaks in their other high-profile caves. They permanently restricted Chauvet to academic research, ensuring the ecosystem remained undisturbed. The government bolted a heavy steel vault door directly across the narrow fissure the cavers had cleared. They installed an industrial airlock, operating on the exact same pressure mechanics as a submarine. Researchers entering the cave have to cycle through the airlock, waiting for the pressure to equalize, keeping the modern outside air completely isolated from the ancient atmosphere inside. The state built a specialized climate control system just for the antechamber to regulate the tiny puffs of air released when the heavy doors cycle open. Inside the cavern, the engineers constructed a network of suspended metal gangways. The steel walkways hang directly over the cave floor, bolted to the walls to ensure that modern boots never crush the fragile bear skulls or compress the Paleolithic footprints. Today, the site is monitored by heavy security cameras and biometric motion sensors. A handful of scientists are allowed inside for a few weeks every spring. When the researchers cross through the airlock, they wear sterilized suits, heavy respirators, and specialized shoes dedicated entirely to the steel walkways. The public is diverted to an enormous concrete replica built a few miles down the road, featuring exact laser-mapped copies of the lions and the panthers. The heavy steel door on the real cave stays locked. The drawings are still sitting on the limestone in the absolute dark, preserved in the exact same stagnant air they had during the last glacial maximum. Number 20. The Sealed Keyhole. Tombs of Japan. From the sky above the modern industrial city of Sakai in Japan, the dense grid of concrete apartment blocks and asphalt highways abruptly stops. In the center of the city sits a massive, perfectly symmetrical forest, shaped like a keyhole. The trees cover over 100 acres. The entire mound is ringed by 3 wide green moats. The structure is so enormous, you can only truly perceive its exact geometry from the air. This is the Daisen Kofun. It is the largest single grave on the planet by surface area, and it is strictly illegal to step onto the grass. The immense hill was built in the 5th century. It serves as the traditional resting place of Emperor Nintoku. Constructing it required hauling nearly 3 million tons of earth by hand, piling the dirt into a circular dome attached to a wide, flared front. The labor took an estimated 2,000 men working every single day for over 15 years. The ancient architects lined the perimeter of the water with thousands of hollow, unglazed clay cylinders called haniwa. The clay is shaped into armored warriors, shields, and horses, planted directly into the mud to stand guard over the shoreline. The figures were designed to physically separate the territory of the living from the territory of the dead. The Imperial Household Agency of Japan manages the site today. They oversee the affairs and the lineage of the Japanese royal family. They treat the hill as an active, sacred family cemetery. The agency manages the largest archaeological footprint in the country, exactly like a private lawn. In the late summer of 1872, a heavy typhoon swept through the Osaka prefecture. The severe wind and rain triggered a landslide on the lower slopes of the primary mound. The mud washed away, exposing a massive stone burial vault in the dirt. The collapsed earth spilled out iron armor, gilded bronze swords, and a delicate glass bowl originally crafted in the Persian Empire. The glass proved that ancient overland trade routes had reached the Japanese archipelago centuries earlier than historians realized. The open vault offered a sudden massive opportunity to map 5th century mortuary practices. The Imperial Household Agency intervened immediately. They collected the exposed items, logged them quietly, and ordered the trench closed. Workers hauled in fresh dirt and stone. They completely backfilled the open vault, packed the mud tight, and reinforced the slope. They built a heavy steel fence at the outer edge of the water and locked the gate. The ban on excavation became absolute. For the last century and a half, no academic archaeologist has been allowed to cross the moats. The agency forbids ground-penetrating radar. They ban sonic mapping, soil coring, and low-altitude drone surveys over the canopy. The internal structure of the main chamber, the layout of the coffins, and the volume of the remaining gold are complete mysteries. In recent years, when heavy storms knock down trees on the lower slopes, the agency allows a tiny handful of researchers to examine the dirt clinging to the torn roots. The researchers must work under strict supervision, and they are specifically forbidden from taking a shovel to the actual ground. The modern city of Sakai simply built its roads and high-rises right up to the edge of the outermost moat. The largest tomb ever constructed sits in the center of millions of people, covered in a silent pine forest, holding its inventory in the dark. Number 21. The Sealed Tomb of the Temple of the Inscriptions. In the summer of 1948, a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruz Luillier was sweeping dirt off the floor of a ruined temple at the top of a pyramid in Palenque. He noticed a single massive flagstone set into the masonry. The edges of the slab featured a series of circular holes drilled straight into the rock. They were heavy stone fingerholds. Palenque was a major Maya city-state, sitting in the dense jungle foothills of southern Mexico. The Temple of the Inscriptions is a massive stepped pyramid dominating the central plaza. Archaeologists in the 1940s operated on a strict consensus regarding these massive structures. They believed Maya pyramids were entirely solid mounds of earth and stone, built exclusively as heavy architectural foundations to elevate the religious temples on top. They assumed the city placed its royal dead in separate dedicated cemeteries in the surrounding jungle. Ruse wedged heavy iron levers into the holes and hauled the slab up. The floor opened into a steep vaulted stone staircase, plunging directly down into the dark core of the pyramid. The ancient Maya had completely filled the stairwell with heavy limestone rubble and wet clay, packing it tight against the ceiling. It was an exceptionally thorough security system. Ruse spent 4 years hand-digging his way through the blockage. The excavation crews hauled the wet clay up the narrow shaft in small buckets, working in 100-degree jungle heat, pulling out tons of material just to clear a few feet of stairs at a time. In 1952, the team hit the bottom of the 80-foot descent. They found a stone box holding the skeletal remains of 6 sacrificed youths. The ancient priests placed them there to guard the entrance to the underworld. Directly behind the guards sat a massive triangular stone door. Ruse shifted the slab and squeezed into a vaulted crypt. The walls were weeping with heavy condensation. 9 figures molded from thick white stucco stood around the perimeter of the room, representing the 9 lords of Xibalba, the Maya underworld. In the center of the floor sat a sarcophagus, carved from a single block of limestone. It was covered by a 5-ton lid intricately carved with the image of the king. The relief shows him falling backward down the trunk of the world tree, descending directly into the open jaws of a massive skeletal centipede. The imagery mapped out his journey into the land of the dead. Ruse brought in automotive jacks to slowly lift the heavy stone lid. Inside the sarcophagus, he found the bones of Kinich Janab Pakal. Pakal ruled Palenque for 68 years in the 7th century. His skeleton was completely buried under a thick layer of brilliant red cinnabar. Cinnabar is a highly toxic mercury ore the Maya used to heavily coat their royal burials, relying on the bright red mineral to symbolize blood and the eastern sunrise. Pakal wore a death mask constructed from 340 individual tiles of green jade, fitted perfectly to the contours of his skull. The jade pieces were originally pierced with small holes and sewn onto a wooden frame that had long since rotted away, letting the green tiles collapse directly onto the bone. The sheer volume of cinnabar dust made the physical excavation of the body a serious chemical hazard. The archaeologists were breathing in aerosolized mercury just by brushing the dirt off the bones to catalog the jade. The discovery forced historians to rewrite their entire understanding of Maya architecture. The Mexican authorities eventually opened the heavy stone stairway to the public to showcase the crypt. For the next 5 decades, a steady line of tourists squeezed down the narrow, steep shaft to look at the massive carved lid. A limestone pyramid in a tropical rainforest operates at the absolute limit of natural humidity. The heavy stone blocks hold moisture like a sponge. When hundreds of tourists climb down the tight tunnel every day, their body heat and exhaled breath overwhelmed the confined space. The heavy moisture condensed rapidly on the cold walls. The thick white stucco figures, the 9 lords of the underworld, began to structurally fail. The condensation dissolved the ancient plaster, turning the rigid carvings into a soft, wet paste. The visitors were sweating the ancient art right off the walls. In 2004, the National Institute of Anthropology and History halted the damage. They evacuated the tourists from the crypt. They climbed back up the 80-foot staircase and locked a heavy steel gate directly over the entrance on the temple floor. They completely banned all public access to the tomb to let the humidity drop and the plaster reharden. The heavy iron gate stays bolted across the floor of the upper temple. The long, narrow stairs are completely empty. King Pakal is still resting at the bottom of the pyramid in his toxic red dust, sitting quietly with his 9 lords in the dark. Number 22. The Sealed Crystal Cave of Nika. In the spring of 2000, two brothers named Eloy and Javier Delgado were drilling a new exploratory tunnel inside the Nika mine in Chihuahua, Mexico. The mine was a massive commercial operation, pulling lead, zinc, and silver out of the bedrock. They were working roughly 1,000 feet below the surface. Eloy swung his drill into the rock face, broke through the limestone, and hit empty space. He shined his headlamp through the hole and saw massive pale obelisks catching the light. The brothers had drilled directly into the cave of the crystals. The chamber was shaped like a massive horseshoe, roughly 90 feet across. It was packed floor to ceiling with the largest natural crystals ever found on Earth. They were massive intersecting beams of selenite, a translucent form of gypsum. The largest pillars stretched over 39 feet long, weighing 55 tons, crossing the room like heavy fallen timber. The geology beneath Naga was essentially a massive pressure cooker. Roughly 2 miles below the cave sits a massive magma chamber. For over 500,000 years, that magma superheated the mineral-rich groundwater filling the cavern above it. The water hit a stable temperature of exactly 136 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there, packed with dissolved calcium sulfate. That perfectly balanced, superheated liquid allowed the selenite to precipitate out of the water and slowly form the giant crystal beams, molecule by molecule, over 500,000 years. The crystals only stopped growing when the commercial mining company arrived. To extract the lead and silver from the mountain, the Nika operation installed massive industrial pumps. The pumps continuously sucked water out of the bedrock, dropping the local water table and entirely draining the cave of the crystals. When the Delgado brothers breached the chamber in 2000, they stepped into a lethal environment. The magma chamber below the cave was still radiating immense heat. With the water gone, the cavern became a humid oven. The ambient air temperature inside the room hovered at 136 degrees, with humidity pushing 99%. In those conditions, human sweat cannot evaporate. The human body completely loses its ability to cool itself, and the core temperature rises rapidly. A person walking into the cave in normal clothes would succumb to severe heat stroke and organ failure within 10 minutes. The mining company immediately secured the steel door leading into the tunnel. When specialized scientific teams arrived to document the crystals, they had to wear custom-built refrigeration suits hooked up to backpacks packed with solid ice. They breathed chilled air through a respirator. Even with the heavy cooling gear, the researchers could only survive in the cavern for 30 to 40 minutes at a time before their core temperatures forced them out. The scientists worked in short bursts over the next 15 years. They managed to extract tiny fluid inclusions, drops of water trapped inside the crystal structure as it formed, and found dormant, ancient bacteria locked inside the selenite for 50,000 years. But the drained cavern presented a massive structural problem. The 50-ton crystals were incredibly fragile. Without the buoyancy of the water supporting their immense weight, the massive beams began to slowly crack and sag. The dry air also caused the surface of the selenite to immediately begin degrading, dulling the pristine edges. The mining operation was unintentionally destroying the chamber just by keeping the water out of it. In October of 2015, the mining company made a financial decision that inadvertently saved the crystals. The Nika mine flooded due to a massive groundwater breach in one of the lower tunnels. Pumping the water back out proved too expensive against the falling price of lead and silver. The company suspended all operations, shut off the remaining industrial pumps, and let the mountain reclaim the tunnels. The water level rapidly rose, back up the limestone shafts. It eventually crested the entrance to the crystal chamber and flooded the room completely, resubmerging the massive pillars in the hot mineral water they grew in. The site is entirely inaccessible today. The steel door is locked underwater. The temperature is back to a stable 136 degrees, and the giant selenite beams are slowly growing again in the dark. Number 23, the sealed First Temple Mount excavation. In the late summer of 1867, a British military engineer named Captain Charles Warren arrived in Jerusalem carrying a signed permit from the Ottoman Empire, a heavy drilling rig, and a few crates of black powder. Warren was sent by the Palestine Exploration Fund to map the biblical city underground. The holiest site in Jerusalem is the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif. The Ottoman governor made it entirely clear that Warren was strictly forbidden from putting a shovel anywhere near the top of the sacred platform. So Warren set his drill up 80 feet away from the outer wall, directly in the middle of a muddy field, and sank a vertical shaft down through the bedrock. He dug down for roughly 100 feet, hit solid limestone, and then began tunneling horizontally toward the holy site. Warren was basically running a covert mining operation beneath one of the most politically sensitive locations on Earth. His workers shored up the tunnels with heavy timber and worked entirely by candlelight in the damp rock. They eventually hit the massive ancient foundation stones of the Western Wall, completely undocumented and buried under centuries of urban rubble. Warren found a small opening near the base of the wall and squeezed through it into a vast, arched underground chamber. He had breached a massive subterranean cistern holding thousands of gallons of stagnant water. The ceiling was supported by heavy stone arches, and the limestone floor was coated in thick black mud. Warren lowered a rowboat through his tunnel, dropped it into the water, and paddled around the dark cavern to map the dimensions. He found a series of long, branching tunnels leading deeper under the Temple Mount itself, likely part of the water management system built by King Herod around 20 BC. The underground architecture was massive, holding enough fresh water to sustain the temple complex above during a siege. The tunnels clearly continued further into the bedrock beneath the sacred platform. But a British soldier paddling a rowboat under the Haram al-Sharif was exactly the kind of activity that triggered riots. When the Ottoman authorities found out Warren had dug horizontally to bypass their surface ban, they sent soldiers to physically pull him out of the tunnels. The governor ordered the immediate closure of the excavation. Warren was forced to pull his timber supports, pack up his surveying equipment, and evacuate the shaft. The Ottomans didn't just backfill the hole. They brought in heavy masonry and permanently sealed the horizontal access tunnel Warren had cut into the bedrock. They walled off the entrance to the massive cistern to ensure no future European explorer could easily access the water system under the holy site. The political and religious tension surrounding the Temple Mount made any excavation inherently dangerous, and the Ottomans preferred the subterranean layout to remain a mystery. For the next century and a half, the exact tunnels Warren mapped remained largely inaccessible. Modern archaeological authorities in Jerusalem occasionally run limited, highly controlled excavations around the perimeter of the Western Wall, strictly negotiating every inch of displaced dirt with the religious trusts that manage the site above. The specific horizontal shaft Warren cut in 1867 is still blocked. The massive stone cistern is still down there in the dark, and the branching tunnels stretching beneath the center of the Temple Mount remain mostly unmapped, sealed away by a diplomatic dispute that started during the American Civil War. Number 24. The Sealed Tunnels of Baiae. In the 1950s, an Italian archaeologist named Amedeo Maiuri was walking the shoreline of the Bay of Naples, mapping the submerged ruins of Baiae. Baiae was basically the Las Vegas of the ancient Roman Empire. It was a sprawling, hyper-wealthy resort town built directly over a volcanic caldera, famous for its thermal baths and massive luxury villas. A large portion of the city had sunk into the Mediterranean due to Bradyseism, the slow rise and fall of the Earth's crust caused by the magma chamber underneath. Maiuri was standing in the ruins of the thermal bath complex when he noticed a narrow, soot-stained tunnel cut directly into the hillside. He shined his flashlight into the hole, saw it plunged deep into the rock, and decided not to go in. He noted the entrance in his records and moved on. The tunnel sat there for another decade. In 1962, a British amateur archaeologist named Robert Paget read Maiuri's notes and decided to investigate the hole himself. Paget crawled into the narrow gap, The air immediately became suffocatingly hot. He was walking directly into the volcanic rock of the Phlegraean Fields. The tunnel was perfectly cut, measuring roughly 2 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The walls were lined with small niches, and every niche contained a thick layer of ancient soot. The Romans had mounted hundreds of oil lamps along the walls to light the passage. Paget kept walking. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, hooking sharply left and right. The temperature climbed to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. He eventually reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 2 parallel passages. He took the right-hand path and found himself standing on the edge of an underground river. The water was boiling. The ancient engineers had deliberately tunneled down to intersect with a natural superheated volcanic spring. The air was filled with sulfurous steam. Paget waded into the dark water and waded across the underground stream. On the other side, the tunnel continued up a short flight of stairs into a small dry antechamber. The chamber was entirely empty, except for a square stone platform sitting in the center of the room. Paget had found the great antrum. He proposed that the entire tunnel system was an elaborate piece of religious theater. In ancient Roman and Greek mythology, the underworld was divided by the river Styx, and the dead had to pay the ferryman Charon to cross it. Paget believed the wealthy patrons of Baiae paid the local priests to experience a simulated descent into Hades. The priests would lead the initiates down the sweltering lamplit tunnel, filling their heads with sulfur fumes and heat exhaustion to disorient them. When they reached the boiling underground river, a priest waiting in a small boat would ferry them across the water to the antechamber, where they would receive a localized, heavily stage-managed prophecy from an oracle sitting on the stone platform. It was essentially an immersive, high-end, haunted house built for Roman senators. Paget mapped the entire system, measuring the exact angle of the descent and the layout of the boiling river. He published his findings in the 1960s, completely detailing the architecture of the simulated underworld. The local Italian authorities took one look at his maps and immediately recognized a massive liability. Baiae is highly seismically active. The tunnels run directly through soft volcanic tuff, filled with scalding steam, toxic sulfur dioxide gas, and temperatures high enough to induce rapid heat stroke. The architecture was specifically designed to be disorienting and dangerous in the first century. 2,000 years of earthquakes had severely compromised the ceilings. If the state opened the tunnels to the public, or even to regular academic researchers, they would eventually have to pull a boiled tourist out of the dark. The Italian government decided the simulated underworld was too realistic. They built a heavy iron gate across the entrance on the hillside and welded it shut. The site is permanently closed. There are no public tours and practically no modern archaeological permits granted for the interior. The heavy metal bars block the narrow shaft on the surface, while the oil lamps still sit empty in the walls, and the volcanic river continues to boil in the dark, exactly where the ancient priests left it. Number 25. The sealed pit of the first emperor's acrobats. In 1999, Chinese archaeologists were running a standard exploratory trench about a mile away from the main mound of the first emperor's tomb. They were working far outside the perimeter of the famous terracotta army pits. They dug down roughly 15 feet and hit a collapsed wooden roof. Beneath the rotted timber, they found a completely new collection of terracotta figures. These figures were not wearing armor, and they were not standing in military formation. They were twisted into severe physical contortions. One figure lay entirely on its back, propped up on its hands and feet in a full back bend. Another balanced on one arm, with its legs thrust into the air. The archaeologists had found the emperor's acrobats. The ancient Chinese imperial court maintained massive troops of entertainers, including weightlifters, wrestlers, and contortionists. The architects of Qin Shi Huang's necropolis believed the emperor needed entertainment in the afterlife just as much as he needed military protection. They modeled these clay performers with extreme anatomical precision. The sculptors carved heavy muscle definition into the torsos to reflect the physical strain of the acrobatics, and painted them to look exactly like the living performers who worked in the palace. The pit also held the remains of a massive bronze cauldron, weighing nearly 500 pounds. The cauldron was likely part of a specific strongman routine, where a performer would lift the heavy vessel by its legs. The excavation team quickly realized they were facing the exact same preservation crisis that plagued the original army pits in the 1970s. The acrobats were originally painted with a thick layer of lacquer, followed by bright pigments. When the figures were pulled from the damp earth, the dry surface air caused the lacquer to immediately curl and flake off. The paint began detaching from the clay almost instantly. The team pulled 11 largely intact figures out of the dirt, rushing them to climate-controlled labs to physically glue the flaking paint back onto the ceramic. They left the remaining fragments and partially buried figures in the trench. They decided the risk of total pigment loss was too high to continue. They laid heavy plastic sheeting over the exposed clay at the bottom of the pit and shoveled the dirt back in. They completely backfilled the excavation, packing the soil tight to restore the subterranean humidity. They sealed the acrobat pit to protect the remaining color, leaving the rest of the contortionists exactly where they fell 2,000 years ago. Number 26. The sealed megalithic tunnels of Malta. In 1902, construction workers building a new residential neighborhood in the Maltese town of Paula broke ground for a housing block. The limestone bedrock was soft, and the trenching equipment easily cracked the surface. The ground gave way, revealing a massive, perfectly carved doorway directly beneath the foundation line. The workers shined a lantern into the gap and found a complex of underground halls. They had dropped into the hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. Malta is a small archipelago sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Between 4000 and 2500 BC, a highly organized, completely isolated civilization flourished on the islands. They built massive, freestanding stone temples above ground, hauling 20-ton limestone blocks into precise circular alignments before the Great Pyramid was even drafted. But their largest project was entirely underground. The builders of the hypogeum used antlers and heavy obsidian tools to carve a sprawling, 3-story necropolis directly into the solid rock. The complex descends nearly 35 feet down, featuring interconnecting halls, curved ceilings, and a massive central chamber called the Holy of Holies. The ancient engineers designed the architecture to manipulate sound. The Oracle Room, a small chamber carved out of the second level, features a precise acoustic resonance. If a man stands in a specific alcove and speaks in a low voice, the sound carries perfectly throughout the entire underground complex, vibrating against the curved walls. The hypogeum wasn't just a temple, it was a massive communal tomb. Over roughly 1,500 years, the ancient Maltese deposited the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals into the side chambers of the complex. They painted the ceilings in bright red ochre spirals and left tiny fat clay figures known as sleeping ladies in the dark alongside the dead. The site is a geological anomaly. The limestone of the hypogeum is extremely soft and incredibly porous. It absorbed the heavy moisture of the Mediterranean air and held the red ochre paint in a delicate balance. When the complex opened to the public in the early 20th century, the sudden influx of daily tourists completely shattered that balance. The heat from hundreds of bodies combined with the electric lighting installed for the tours, turning the underground chambers into an incubator. Algae and thick black mold began rapidly growing across the walls, eating directly into the 5,000-year-old red ochre. The humidity levels spiked so high that water constantly dripped from the carved ceilings, washing the ancient paint straight into the dirt floor. In 1990, the Maltese government recognized the site was actively dissolving. They ordered the doors closed. They locked the entrance and shut off the lights. The hypogeum sat completely dark for the next 10 years. The conservation teams spent a decade slowly stabilizing the internal climate, installing a highly sensitive environmental control system to dry out the walls and halt the mold. They realized the only way the complex could survive was if the human presence was almost entirely eliminated. Today, the site operates under one of the strictest entry limits of any UNESCO monument on Earth, Only 10 people are allowed inside the complex per hour for a maximum of 80 visitors a day. The tickets are booked months in advance. The entrance features a heavily sealed, climate-controlled antechamber where visitors must wait for the heavy doors to cycle, ensuring no untreated surface air makes it down into the first level. The vast majority of the time, the heavy doors are closed. The 3 stories of carved rock sit empty. The acoustics of the oracle room remain completely silent, and the soft limestone is kept tightly sealed in the dark. Number 27. The sealed Etruscan tomb of the Roaring Lions. In 2006, an Italian police task force raided a private warehouse outside of Rome. The warehouse belonged to a well-known tombarolo, the local Italian term for a professional grave robber. The police were specifically looking for looted classical pottery. Instead, they found a detailed, hand-drawn map sitting on a workbench. The map marked a location in a muddy field near the town of Vai, just north of the city. The coordinates pointed to an entirely unknown archaeological site. The police handed the map over to the state archaeologists, who drove out to the field and started digging. They cut through the topsoil and found a massive square chamber carved directly into the volcanic tuff. It was an Etruscan tomb. The Etruscans were a highly advanced civilization that controlled central Italy before the Romans entirely absorbed them. They built massive underground necropolises and decorated them heavily, but because the Romans were so thorough in wiping out their culture, untouched Etruscan sites are incredibly rare. This tomb dated to roughly 700 BC, making it one of the oldest painted tombs ever discovered in the Mediterranean. When the archaeologists dropped into the chamber, they found the walls covered in bright red and black frescoes. The dominant image was a procession of stylized, open-mouthed felines with long tails and bared teeth. The researchers called it the Tomb of the Roaring Lions. The artists had painted the lions, along with migratory birds and geometric patterns, directly onto the soft volcanic rock. The tomb also held the physical remains of an Etruscan aristocrat. The burial included a heavy bronze sword, the iron wheels of a ceremonial chariot, and an assortment of intact Corinthian pottery. The grave robbers, who drew the map, had clearly breached the ceiling, stolen a few smaller items, and then planned to come back to strip the bronze. The police raid stopped them just before they could empty the chamber. But the real threat to the tomb wasn't the looters. It was the air. The volcanic tuff around Veii is extremely porous. For 2,700 years, the sealed chamber maintained a perfect microclimate. The air was heavily saturated with moisture, which prevented the soft rock from drying out and crumbling. When the looters cracked the ceiling to look inside, they broke that environmental seal. The dry summer air rushed into the chamber. By the time the archaeologists arrived a few months later, the damage was already accelerating. The volcanic rock was rapidly dehydrating. The surface of the walls began to flake, taking the red and black pigment with it. The roaring lions were literally peeling off the walls. The researchers realized that keeping the tomb open for a prolonged excavation or trying to shore it up for public display would destroy the art completely within a year. The Italian authorities ran an emergency salvage operation. They spent just a few weeks inside the chamber, working as quickly as possible. They carefully lifted the bronze sword, the chariot wheels, and the pottery out of the dirt, moving the artifacts to a secure climate-controlled lab in Rome. They took thousands of high-resolution digital photographs of the painted walls, mapping every square inch of the lions. Then they backed out of the chamber. They didn't just lock a gate over the entrance. The archaeologists brought in heavy earth-moving equipment. They filled the entire subterranean room with soft, sterile sand, burying the painted walls completely. They packed the sand tight, filling the chamber all the way to the ceiling to ensure the rock wouldn't dry out any further. They poured tons of dirt back over the top of the site, perfectly leveling the field. They erased the tomb from the surface. The roaring lions are currently buried under tons of packed earth, surviving purely because they are completely inaccessible. Number 28. The sealed tombs of the Guanche. In the late 1800s, Spanish agricultural workers were clearing a rocky ravine on the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands. They were breaking up the volcanic scree to plant terraced vineyards. One of the workers wedged a crowbar under a heavy basalt slab and levered it aside, expecting to find more packed dirt. Instead, the rock opened into a deep volcanic cave. The workers climbed down and found the floor lined with dozens of human bodies, all wrapped tightly in layers of sewn goatskin. They had dropped into a necropolis of the Guanche people. The Guanche were the indigenous inhabitants of the Canary Islands before the Spanish conquest in the 15th century. They lived in total isolation from the African mainland for roughly 2,000 years, developing their own language, religion, and highly specific mortuary practices. When a member of the Guanche nobility died, specialized embalmers washed the body, packed the internal cavities with a mixture of volcanic pumice, pine bark, and resin, and left the corpse in the sun to desiccate. Once the body was completely dehydrated, they wrapped it in dozens of overlapping layers of cured goatskin, binding it tight with the leather cords. The embalmers carried the wrapped bodies, known as zaxos, high into the steep volcanic ravines, hiding them in natural caves sealed behind heavy rock falls. The Spanish conquest practically wiped out the Guanche culture, but the caves stayed hidden, preserving the mummies in the dry, stable volcanic rock. When the agricultural workers opened the ravine cave in the 1800s, they triggered a massive European black market. Wealthy Victorian collectors viewed the Guanche mummies as exotic curiosities. The mummies were systematically dragged out of the caves and sold to private buyers across Europe. They were shipped to museums in Paris, London, and Madrid, where the leather wrappings were routinely cut open for display. The sudden exposure to humid European air caused the desiccated tissue to immediately begin rotting. Dozens of the mummies fell apart in museum basements. The localized grave, robbing on Tenerife, stripped the most accessible ravines completely bare. In the late 20th century, the regional government of the Canary Islands officially recognized the destruction. They passed strict heritage laws protecting the remaining unexcavated caves. The authorities realized that physically removing a newly discovered mummy from its volcanic vault was incredibly risky. The goatskin wrappings become extremely brittle over 1,000 years. Moving the body frequently shatters the leather and breaks the desiccated bones inside. The environmental shift from a dry, sealed cave to a modern, air-conditioned museum lab often initiates rapid decay before the conservators can stabilize the tissue. The government implemented a policy of in situ preservation. When modern hikers or road crews accidentally expose a new Guanche burial cave in the ravines, the archaeologists document the contents quickly. They take minimal, non-destructive samples for carbon dating. They do not extract the bodies. They haul the heavy basalt slabs back over the opening. They pack the gaps with local stone and cement the entrance shut, blending the seal directly into the natural cliff face. The exact locations of the newly discovered caves are classified by the state to prevent looting. The mummies are left exactly where the ancient embalmers placed them, resting in the dark, bound in goatskin. Number 29. The sealed underground basilica of Porta Maggiore. In April of 1917, construction crews were digging deep trenches to reinforce a railroad line leading into Rome's central station. The earth buckled beneath a heavy steam shovel, opening a dark, 40-foot shaft straight down into the bedrock. Engineers lowered lanterns into the hole and found themselves looking into a vast, three-naved cathedral cut entirely out of solid volcanic tuff, sitting 40 feet below the noisy modern street. It was a first-century underground basilica, built secretly during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. The structure belonged to a mysterious outlawed Neo-Pythagorean sect, a cult of ancient mystics who worshipped numbers, silence, and the immortality of the soul. The ancient architects had dug narrow shafts into the earth, poured concrete into the soil to form vaulted pillars, and then excavated the dirt from the inside out, creating a subterranean sanctuary without ever disturbing the surface above. The walls and ceilings were covered in breathtaking, pure white stucco reliefs showing souls leaping into the underworld and mythical figures floating across delicate plaster skies. The ancient mystics had abandoned the sanctuary around 50 AD. sealing the overhead light shaft to keep their secret room hidden in the dark. For nearly 2,000 years, the chamber maintained a completely motionless atmosphere, preserving the delicate white plasterwork as sharply as the day it was molded. When the modern railway workers broke through in 1917, the outside world rushed in. The vibration of heavy diesel trains running on the tracks directly above the ceiling began cracking the ancient vaults. Worse, the damp, polluted air from the modern city seeped through the breach, bringing a sudden outbreak of destructive green algae and white mold that started consuming the ancient stucco reliefs. Recognizing that exposure was rapidly dissolving one of the most mysterious sanctuaries of ancient Rome, authorities stepped in to stop the decay. They enclosed the entire basilica in an underground concrete shell designed to absorb the tremors of passing trains. They installed a heavy, hermetically sealed airlock door at the top of the access tunnel and banned all public access. The basilica is locked beneath the rumbling train tracks of Rome, sitting in total silence inside its climate-controlled airlock, its white stucco gods staring across the dark room exactly as the ancient mystics left them. Number 30. The Sealed Osiris Shaft of Giza. In 1930, the Egyptian archaeologist Salim Hassan was clearing sand from the stone causeway connecting the Sphinx to the Pyramid of Khafra. He found a vertical shaft cut directly into the bedrock floor. He climbed down 30 feet to a carved room, found a second shaft, and climbed down another 40 feet to a second level, holding 6 empty burial niches. In one corner of that lower room, a third shaft dropped straight down into pitch-black water. Hassan lacked the industrial technology to drain the pit, so he mapped the upper rooms, climbed back to the surface, and left the flooded level alone. The bottom of the shaft sat undisturbed in the dark for another 69 years. In the late summer of 1999, an archaeological team led by Zahi Hawass returned to the causeway with heavy diesel water pumps. The team hauled the equipment down into the narrow rock chimneys and dropped thick intake hoses into the black water. They switched the engines on and started draining a subterranean cavern sitting roughly 100 feet below the desert. The machines ran continuously, pulling thousands of gallons of groundwater up through the shafts to dump onto the sand above. As the water level slowly dropped, the team set up heavy floodlights and climbed down the slick, wet ladders into the third level. The ancient engineers had carved a large square platform directly out of the bedrock. They cut a deep trench around the entire perimeter of the platform to create a moat. The natural water table seeped through the porous limestone and filled the trench, creating an artificial subterranean island. 4 thick stone pillars anchored the corners of the island. Sitting perfectly in the center of the rock was a massive sarcophagus carved from black basalt. The architects had built a physical functioning scale model of the tomb of Osiris. In Egyptian theology, life began on a primordial mound of earth rising out of the infinite waters of creation. The flooded moat represented that endless ocean, and the island held the god of the dead. The archaeologists rigged heavy hoists and cracked the basalt lid. The interior of the sarcophagus was completely empty. The hollow box served purely as a symbolic anchor for the religious machinery of the room. The priests carved the heavy stone and let the dark water in specifically to satisfy the mythology of the underworld. The continuous pumping operation was structurally dangerous. The Giza Plateau sits on a vast, interconnected aquifer, fed directly by the Nile. The diesel pumps were essentially fighting the entire hydrology of the river basin. Running the machines constantly to keep the chamber dry risked pulling too much moisture out of the surrounding limestone. Rapidly dehydrating the soft rock threatened to crack the walls and collapse the ceilings of the upper shafts. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities reviewed the site logistics. They decided that operating a permanent industrial pumping station just to keep an empty basalt box dry was bad policy. The excavation team documented the dimensions of the island, photographed the pillars, and hauled their floodlights back up the iron ladders. They pulled the heavy intake hoses out of the shaft and turned the diesel engines off. The groundwater immediately began seeping back through the walls of the cavern. It filled the moat, crept up the sides of the stone platform, and spilled over the floor. The water swallowed the pillars and completely submerged the black sarcophagus, locking the bottom of the shaft in the dark exactly the way the ancient engineers designed it. That is, 30 doors pulled open and pushed shut again. Some were sealed to protect the past from the modern air, and some were closed because the earth simply took them back. The ground is full of quiet rooms, waiting in the dark. You can sleep now. Good night.